Chapter 25 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr., Chapter 25. Thus fate did not wait until Election Day for the thing Hale most dreaded, the clash that would involve the Guard in the Tolliver Falin troubles over the hills. There had been simply a preliminary political gathering at the Gap the day before, but it had been a crucial day for the Guard, from a cloudy sunrise to a tragic sunset. Early that morning, Mockaby, the town sergeant, had stepped into the street freshly shaven, with polished boots and his best clothes for the eyes of his sweetheart, who was to come up that day to the Gap from Lee. Before sunset he died with those boots on, while the sweetheart, unknowing, was bound on her happy way homeward, and Rufe Tolliver, who had shot Mockaby, was clattering through the Gap in flight for Lonesome Cove. As far as anybody knew, there had been but one Tolliver and one Falin in town that day, though many had noticed the tall, western-looking stranger who early in the afternoon had ridden across the bridge over the North Fork. But he was quiet and well-behaved. He merged into the crowd, and through the rest of the afternoon was in no way conspicuous, even when the one Tolliver and the one Falin got into a fight in front of the spieler stand, and the riot started, which came near ending in a bloody battle. The Falin was clearly blameless and was let go at once. This angered the many friends of the Tolliver, and when he was arrested, there was an attempt at rescue, and the Tolliver was dragged to the calaboose behind a slowly retiring line of policemen, who were jabbing the rescuers back with the muzzles of their cocked Winchesters. It was just when it was all over and the Tolliver was safely jailed, that Bad Rufe galloped up to the calaboose, shaking with rage, for he had just learned that the prisoner was a Tolliver. He saw how useless interference was, but he swung from his horse, threw the reins over its head after the Western fashion, and strode up to Hale. "You the captain of this guard?" "Yes," said Hale. "And you?" Rufe shook his head with angry impatience, and Hale, thinking he had some communication to make, ignored his refusal to answer. "I hear that a fellow can't blow a whistle or holler or shoot off his pistol in this town without getting arrested." "That's true. Why?" Rufe's black eyes gleamed vindictively. "Nothin'," he said, and he turned to his horse. 10 minutes later, as Mockaby was passing down the dummy track, a whistle was blown on the river bank, a high yell was raised, a pistol shot quickly followed, and he started for the sound of them on a run. A few minutes later, 3 more pistol shots rang out, and Hale rushed to the river bank to find Mockaby stretched out on the ground, dying, and a mountaineer lout pointing after a man on horseback, who was making at a swift gallop for the mouth of the Gap and the hills. "He done it," said the lout in a frightened way, "but I don't know who he was." Within half an hour 10 horsemen were clattering after a murderer, headed by Hale, Logan, and the infant of the Guard. Where the road forked, a woman with a child in her arms said she had seen a tall, black-eyed man with a black mustache gallop up the right fork. She no more knew who he was than any of the pursuers. 3 miles up that fork they came upon a red-headed man leading his horse from a mountaineer's yard. "He went up the mountain," the red-haired man said, pointing to the trail of the Lonesome Pine. "He's gone over the line. What's he done? Killed somebody?" "Yes," said Hale shortly, starting up his horse. I wish I'd 'a' knowed you was after him. I'm sheriff over thar." Now they were without warrant or requisition, and Hale, pulling in, said sharply, "We want that fellow. He killed a man at the Gap. If we catch him over the line, we want you to hold him for us. Come along." The red-headed sheriff sprang on his horse and grinned eagerly. "I'm your man." "Who was that fellow?" asked Hale as they galloped. The sheriff denied knowledge with a shake of his head. "What's your name?" The sheriff looked sharply at him for the effect of his answer. "Jim Falin." And Hale looked sharply back at him. He was one of the Falins who long ago had gone to the Gap for young Dave Tolliver, and now the Falin grinned at Hale. "I know you all right." No wonder the Falin chuckled at his heaven-born chance to get a Tolliver into trouble. At the Lonesome Pine, the traces of the fugitive's horse swerved along the mountain top. the shoe of the right forefoot being broken in half. The swerve was a blind, and the sheriff knew it, but he knew where Rufe Tolliver would go, and that there would be plenty of time to get him. Moreover, he had a purpose of his own, and a secret fear that it might be thwarted. So without a word he followed the trail till darkness hid it, and they had to wait until the moon rose. Then, as they started again, the sheriff said, "Wait a minute," and plunged down the mountain side on foot. A few minutes later he hallooed for Hale, and down there showed him the tracks doubling backward along a footpath. "Regular rabbit, ain't he?" chuckled the sheriff, and back they went to the trail again, on which, 200 yards below the Pine, they saw the tracks pointing again to Lonesome Cove. On down the trail they went, and at the top of the spur that overlooked Lonesome Cove, the Falin sheriff pulled in suddenly and got off his horse. There the tracks swerved again into the bushes. "He's going to wait till daylight for fear somebody's follered him. He'll come back, old Devil Judd's." "How do you know he's going to Devil Judd's?" asked Hale. "Where else would he go?" asked the Falin, with a sweep of his arm toward the moonlit wilderness. "There ain't but one house that way for 10 miles. Nobody lives thar." "How do you know that he's going to any house?" asked Hale impatiently. "He may be getting out of the mountains." "Do you ever know a feller to leave these mountains just because he killed a man? How'd you follow him at night? How'd you ever catch him with his start? What'd he turn that way for, if he wasn't going to Judd's? Why don't he keep on down the river? If he's gone, he's gone. If he ain't, he'll be at Devil Judd's at daybreak, if he ain't there now." "What do you want to do?" "Go on down with the hosses, hide 'em in the bushes, and wait." "Maybe he's already heard us coming down the mountain." "That's the only thing I'm afeard of," said the Falin calmly. "But what I'm telling you is your only chance." "How do you know he won't hear us going down? Why not leave the horses?" "We might need the horses, and it's mud and sand all the way. You ought to know that." Hale did know that. So on they went quietly, and hid their horses aside from the road near the place where Hale had fished when he first went to Lonesome Cove. There the Falin disappeared on foot. "Do you trust him?" asked Hale, turning to Bud, and Bud laughed. "I reckon you can trust a Falin against a friend of a Tolliver, or the other way round any time." Within half an hour the Falin came back with the news that there was no sign that the fugitive had come in. "No use surrounding the house now," he said. "He might see one of us first when he comes in and get away. We'll do that after daylight." And at daylight they saw the fugitive ride out of the woods at the back of the house and boldly around to the front of the house, where he left his horse in the yard and disappeared. "Now send 3 men to catch him if he runs out the back way, quick," said the Falin. "It'll take 'em 20 minutes to get thar through the woods. As soon as they get there, let one of 'em shoot off his pistol, and that'll be the signal for us." The 3 men started swiftly, but the pistol shot came before they had gone 100 yards. For one of the 3, a new man and unaccustomed to the use of firearms, stumbled over a root while he was seeing that his pistol was in order, and let it go off accidentally. "No time to waste now," the Falin called sharply. "Get on your horses and get." Then the rush was made, and when they gave up the chase at noon that day, the sheriff looked Hale squarely in the eye when Hale sharply asked him a question. "Why didn't you tell me who that man was?" "Because I feared you wouldn't go to Devil Judd's after him. I know better now." And he shook his head, for he did not understand. And so Hale, at the head of the disappointed guard, went back to the Gap. And when next day they laid Maccabee away in the thinly populated little graveyard that rested in the hollow of the river's arm, the spirit of law and order in the heart of every guard gave way to the spirit of revenge, and the grass would grow under the feet of none until Rufe Tolliver was caught and the death debt of law was paid with death. That purpose was no less firm in the heart of Hale, and he turned away from the grave, sick with the trick that fate had lost no time in playing on him. For he was a Falin now in the eyes of both factions, and an enemy even to June. The weeks dragged slowly along, and June sank slowly toward the depths with every fresh realization of the trap of circumstances into which she had fallen. She had dim memories of just such a state of affairs when she was a child, for the feud was on now, and the three things that governed the life of the cabin in Lonesome Cove were hate, caution, and fear. Bub and her father worked in the fields with their Winchesters close at hand, and June was never easy if they were outside the house. If someone shouted hello, that universal hail of friend or enemy in the mountains, from the gate after dark, one or the other would go out the back door and answer from the shelter of the corner of the house. Neither sat by the light of the fire where he could be seen through the window, nor carried a candle from one room to the other. And when either rode down the river, June must ride behind them to prevent ambush from the bushes, for no Kentucky mountaineer, even to kill his worst enemy, will risk harming a woman. Sometimes Loretta would come and spend the day, and she seemed a little less distressed than June. Dave was constantly in and out, and several times June had seen the Red Fox hanging around. Always the talk was of the feud. The killing of this Tolliver and that long ago was rehearsed over and over. All the wrongs the family had suffered at the hands of the Falins were retold, and in spite of herself, June felt the old hatred of her childhood reawakening against them so fiercely that she was startled, and she knew that if she were a man she would be as ready now to take up a Winchester against the Falins as though she had known no other life. Loretta got no comfort from her in her tentative efforts to talk to Buck Falin, and once indeed June gave her a scathing rebuke. With every day her feeling for her father and Bub was knit a little more closely, and toward Dave grew a little more kindly. She had her moods even against Hale, but they always ended in a storm of helpless tears. Her father said little of Hale, but that little was enough. Young Dave was openly exultant when he heard of the favoritism shown of Falin by the guard at the Gap, the effort Hale had made to catch Rufus Tolliver, and his well-known purpose yet to capture him. For the guard maintained a fund for the arrest and prosecution of criminals, and the reward it offered for Rufus, dead or alive, was known by everybody on both sides of the state line. For nearly a week no word was heard of the fugitive, and then one night after supper, while June was sitting at the fire, the back door was opened. Rufus slid like a snake within, and when June sprang to her feet with a sharp cry of terror, he gave his brutal laugh. "Don't take much to scare you, does it?" Shuddering, she felt his evil eyes sweep her from head to foot, for the beast within was always unleashed and ever ready to spring, and she dropped back into her seat speechless. Young Dave, entering from the kitchen, saw Rufus look, and the hostile lightning of his eyes flashed at his foster uncle, who knew straightway that he must not, for his own safety, strain the boy's jealousy too far. "You oughtn't 'a' done it, Rufus," said old Judd a little later, and he shook his head. Again Rufus laughed. "No," he said with a quick pacificatory look to young Dave. "Not to him." The swift gritting of Dave's teeth showed that he knew what was meant, and without warning the instinct of a protecting tigress leaped within June. She had seen and had been grateful for the look Dave gave the outlaw, but without a word she rose now and went to her own room. While she sat at her window, her stepmother came out the back door and left it open for a moment. Through it June could hear the talk. "No," said her father, "she ain't going to marry him." Dave grunted, and Rufus' voice came again. "Ain't no danger, I reckon, of her tellin' on me." "No," said her father gruffly, and the door banged. No, thought June, she wouldn't, even without her father's trust, though she loathed the man, and he was the only thing on earth of which she was afraid. That was the miracle of it, and June wondered. She was a Tolliver, and the clan loyalty of a century forbade, that was all. As she rose she saw a figure sulking past the edge of the woods. She called Bub in and told him about it, and Rufus stayed at the cabin all night, but June did not see him next morning, and she kept out of his way whenever he came again. A few nights later the Red Fox slouched up to the cabin with some herbs for the stepmother. Old Judd eyed him askance. "Looking for that reward, Red?" The old man had no time for the meek reply that was on his lips, for the old woman spoke up sharply. "You let Red alone, Judd. I told him to come." And the Red Fox stayed to supper. And when Rufe left the cabin that night, a bent figure with a big rifle and in moccasins sneaked after him. The next night there was a tap on Hale's window, just at his bedside, and when he looked out he saw the Red Fox's big rifle, telescope, moccasins, and all in the moonlight. The Red Fox had discovered the whereabouts of Rufe Tolliver, and that very night he guided Hale and 6 of the guard to the edge of a little clearing where the Red Fox pointed to a one-roomed cabin, quiet in the moonlight. Hale had his requisition now. "Ain't no trouble catching Rufe if you bait him with a woman," he snarled. "There might be several Tollivers in there. Wait till daybreak and get the drop on him when he comes out." And then he disappeared. Surrounding the cabin, Hale waited, and on top of the mountain above Lonesome Cove, the Red Fox sat waiting and watching through his big telescope. Through it he saw Bad Rufe step outside the door at daybreak and stretch his arms with a yawn, and he saw 3 men spring with leveled Winchesters from behind a clump of bushes. The woman shot from the door behind Rufe with a pistol in each hand, but Rufe kept his hands in the air and turned his head to the woman, who lowered the half-raised weapon slowly. When he saw the cavalcade start for the county seat with Rufe manacled in the midst of them, he dropped slowly down into Lonesome Cove to tell Judd that Rufe was a prisoner, and to retake him on the way to jail. And, as the Red Fox well knew would happen, old Judd and young Dave and 2 other Tollivers, who were at the cabin, galloped into the county seat to find Rufe in jail, and that jail guarded by 7 grim young men armed with Winchesters and shotguns. Hale faced the old man quietly, eye to eye. "It's no use, Judd," he said. "You'd better let the law take its course." The old man was scornful. "There's never been a Tolliver convicted of killin' nobody, much less hangin'. There ain't goin' to be." "Glad you warned me," said Hale, still quietly, "though it wasn't necessary. But if he's convicted, he'll hang." The giant's face worked in convulsive helplessness, and he turned away. "You hold the cards now, but my deal is comin'." "All right, Judd. You're getting a square one from me." Back rode the Tollivers, and Devil Judd never opened his lips again until he was at home in Lonesome Cove. June was sitting on the porch when he walked heavy-handed through the gate. "They've ketched Rufe," he said, and after a moment he added gruffly, "There's goin' to be sure enough trouble now. The Falins think all them police fellers are on their side now. This ain't no place for you. You must get away." June shook her head, and her eyes turned to the flowers at the edge of the garden. "I'm not going away, Dad," she said. End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 26. Back to the passing of Boone and the landing of Columbus, no man in that region had ever been hanged. And as old Judd said, no Tolliver had ever been sentenced, and no jury of mountain men, as well knew, could be found who would convict a Tolliver, for there were no 12 men in the mountains who would dare. And so the Tollivers decided to wait the outcome of the trial and rest easy. But they did not count on the mettle and intelligence of the grim young furriners, who were a gaping wedge of civilization at the Gap. Straightway they gave up the practice of law and banking and trading and storekeeping, and cut portholes in the brick walls of the courthouse, and guarded town and jail night and day. They brought their own fearless judge, their own fearless jury, and their own fearless guard. Such an abstract regard for law and order the mountaineer finds a hard thing to understand. It looked as though the motive of the guard was vindictive and personal, and old Judd was almost stifled by the volcanic rage that daily grew within him as the toils daily tightened about Rufe Tolliver. Every happening the old man learned through the Red Fox, who, with his huge pistols, was one of the men who escorted Rufe to and from courthouse and jail, a volunteer, Hale supposed, because he hated Rufe, and as the Tollivers supposed, so that he could keep them advised of everything that went on, which he did with secrecy and his own peculiar faith. and steadily, and to the growing uneasiness of the Tollivers, the law went its way. Rufe had proved that he was at the Gap all day, and had taken no part in the trouble. He produced a witness, the mountain lout who Hale remembered, who admitted that he had blown the whistle, given the yell, and fired the pistol shot. When asked his reason, the witness, who was stupid, had none ready, looked helplessly at Rufe, and finally mumbled, "For fun." But it was plain from the questions that Rufe had put to Hale only a few minutes before the shooting, and from the hesitation of the witness, that Rufe had used him for a tool. So the testimony of Maccabee, without even summoning Rufe to surrender, had fired first, carried no conviction. And yet Rufe had no trouble making it almost sure that he had never seen the dead man before. So what was his motive? It was then that the word reached the ear of the prosecuting attorney of the only testimony that could establish a motive and make the crime a hanging offense, and court was adjourned for a day, while he sent for the witness who could give it. That afternoon, one of the Falins, who had grown bolder, and in twos and threes were always at the trial, shot at a Tolliver on the edge of town, and there was an immediate turmoil between the factions that the Red Fox had been waiting for, and that suited his dark purpose well. That very night, with his big rifle, he slipped through the woods to a turn in the road, over which old Dave Tolliver was to pass next morning, and built a blind behind some rocks and lay there smoking peacefully and dreaming his Swedenborgian dreams. And when a wagon came through the turn, driven by a boy, and with the gaunt frame of old Dave Tolliver lying in straw on the bed of it, his big rifle thundered and the frightened horses dashed on with the Red Fox's last enemy, lifeless. Coolly he slipped back to the woods, threw the shell from his gun. Tirelessly he went by short cuts through the hills, and at noon, benevolent and smiling, he was on guard again. The little courtroom was crowded for the afternoon session. Inside the railings sat Rufe Tolliver, white and defiant, manacled. Leaning on the railing, to one side, was the Red Fox with his big pistols, his good profile calm, dreamy, kind. To the other, similarly armed, was Hale. At each of the gaping portholes, and on each side of the door, stood a guard with a Winchester, and around the railing outside were several more. In spite of the window and porthole, the air was close and heavy with the smell of tobacco and the sweat of men. Here and there in the crowd was a red Falin, but Nala Tolliver was in sight, and Rufe Tolliver sat alone. The clerk called the court to order after the fashion since the days before Edward the Confessor, except that he asked God to save a commonwealth instead of a king, and the prosecuting attorney rose. "Next witness, may it please your honor," and as the clerk got to his feet with a slip of paper in his hand and bawled out a name, Hale wheeled from a thumping heart. The crowd vibrated, turned heads, gave way, and through the human aisle walked June Tolliver, with the sheriff following meekly behind. At the railing gate she stopped, head uplifted, face pale and indignant, and her eyes swept past Hale as if he were no more than a wooden image, and were fixed with a proud inquiry on the judge's face. She was bareheaded, her bronze hair was drawn low over her white brow, her gown was of purple homespun, and her right hand was clenched tight about the chased silver handle of a riding whip. In her eyes, mouth, and in every line of her tense figure was the mute question, "Why have you brought me here?" "Here, please," said the judge gently, as though he was about to answer that question, and as she passed Hale she seemed to swerve her skirts aside, that they might not touch him. "Swear her." June lifted her right hand, put her lips to the soiled old black Bible, and faced the jury and Hale and bade Rufe Tolliver, whose black eyes never left her face. "What is your name?" asked a deep voice that struck her ears as familiar, and before she answered she swiftly recalled that she had heard that voice speaking when she entered the door. "June Tolliver." "Your age?" 18. "You live?" "In Lonesome Cove." "You are the daughter of?" "Judd Tolliver." "Do you know the prisoner?" "He is my foster uncle." "Were you at home the night of August the 10th?" "I was." "Have you ever heard the prisoner express any enmity against the volunteer police guard?" He waved his hand toward the men in the portholes and about the railing, unconsciously leaving his hand directly pointed at Hale. June hesitated, and Ruth leaned one elbow on the table, and the light of his eyes beat with fierce intensity into the girl's eyes, into which came a curiously frightened look that Hale remembered. The same look she had shown long ago when Ruth's name was mentioned in the old miller's cabin, and when going up the river road she had put her childish trust in him to see that her bad uncle bothered her no more. Hale had never forgot that, and if it had not been absurd, he would have stopped the prisoner from staring at her now. An anxious look had come into Ruth's eyes. Would she lie for him? "Never," said June. Ah, she would. She was a Tolliver, and Ruth took a breath of deep content. "You never heard him express any enmity toward the police guard? Before that night?" "I have answered that question," said June with dignity, and Ruth's lawyer was on his feet. "Your Honor, I object," he said indignantly. "I apologize," said the deep voice sincerely, and he bowed to June. Then, very quietly, "What was the last thing you heard the prisoner say that afternoon when he left your father's house?" It had come. How well she remembered just what he had said, and how, that night, even when she was asleep, Ruth's words had clanged like a bell in her brain. What her awakening terror was when she knew that the deed was done, and the stifling fear that the victim might be Hale. Swiftly her mind worked. Somebody had blabbed. Her stepmother, perhaps? What Ruth had said had reached a Falin ear and come to the relentless man in front of her. She remembered, too, now, what the deep voice was saying as she came into the door. "There must be deliberation. A malicious purpose proved to make the prisoner's crime a capital offense. I admit that, of course, Your Honor." "Very well, we propose to prove that now." And then she had heard her name called. The proof that was to send Ruth Tolliver to the scaffold was to come from her. That was why she was here. Her lips opened, and Ruth's eyes, like a snake's, caught her own and held them. "He said he was going over to the Gap." There was a commotion at the door. Again the crowd parted, and in towered giant June Tolliver, pushing people aside as though they were straws, his bushy hair wild and his great frame shaking from head to foot with rage. "You went to my house," he rumbled hoarsely, glaring at Hale, "and took my gal there when I wasn't at home. You—" "Order in the court," said the judge sternly, but already at a signal from Hale several guards were pushing through the crowd, and old Judd saw them coming, and saw the Falins about him, and the Winchesters at the portholes, and he stopped with a hard gulp and stood looking at June. "Repeat his last words," said the deep voice again, as calmly as though nothing had happened. "He said, 'I'm going over to the Gap,'" and still Ruth's black eyes held her with mesmeric power. Would she lie for him? It was a terrible struggle for June. Her father was there, her Uncle Dave was dead, her foster uncle's life hung in her next words, and she was a Tolliver. Yet she had given her oath, she had kissed the sacred book in which she believed from cover to cover with her whole heart, and she could feel upon the blue eyes of a man for whom a lie was impossible, and to whom she had never stained her white soul with a word of untruth. "Yes," encouraged the deep voice kindly. Not a soul in the room knew where the struggle lay, not even the girl, for it lay between the black eyes of Ruth Tolliver and the blue eyes of John Hale. "Yes," repeated the deep voice again. Again, with her eyes on Ruth, she repeated, "I'm going over to the Gap." Her face turned deadly white. She shivered. Her dark eyes swerved suddenly full on Hale, and she said slowly and distinctly, yet hardly above a whisper, "To kill me a policeman." "That will do," said the deep voice gently, and Hale started toward her. She looked so deadly sick, and she trembled so when she tried to rise, but she saw him, and her mouth steadied. She rose, and without looking at him, passed by his outstretched hand, and walked slowly out of the courtroom. End of chapter 26. Recording by Ray Smith, Phoenix, Arizona. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr.
Chapter 27 of The Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 27. The miracle had happened. The Tollivers, following the Red Fox's advice to make no attempt at rescue just then, had waited, expecting the old immunity from the law, and getting instead the swift sentence that Ruth Tolliver should be hanged by the neck until he was dead. Astounding and convincing though the news was, no mountaineer believed he would ever hang. And Rufe himself faced the sentence defiant. He laughed when he was led back to his cell. "I'll never hang," he said scornfully. They were the first words that came from his lips, and the first words that came from old Judd's when the news reached him in Lonesome Cove. And that night old Judd gathered his clan for the rescue, to learn next morning that during the night Rufe had been spirited away to the capital for safe keeping until the fatal day. And so there was quiet for a while, old Judd making ready for the day when Rufe should be brought back, and trying to find out who it was that had slain his brother Dave. The Falins denied the deed, but old Judd never questioned that one of them was the murderer, and he came out openly now and made no secret of the fact that he meant to have revenge. And so the two factions went armed, watchful and wary, especially the Falins, who were lying low and waiting to fulfill a deadly purpose of their own. They well knew that old Judd would not open hostilities on them until Rufe Tolliver was dead or at liberty. They knew that the old man meant to try to rescue Rufe when he was brought back to jail or taken from it to the scaffold, and when either day came, they themselves would take a hand, thus giving the Tollivers at one and the same time two sets of foes. And so, through the golden September days, the two clans waited, and June Tolliver went with dull determination back to her old life. For Uncle Billy's sister had left the house in fear, and she could get no help, milking cows at cold dawn, helping with the kitchen, spinning flax and wool, and weaving them into rough garments for her father and stepmother and Bob. And in time she thought grimly for herself, for not another cent for her maintenance could now come from John Hale, even though he claimed it was hers, even though it was in truth her own. Never but once had John Hale's name been mentioned in the cabin. Never but once had her father referred to the testimony that she had given against Rufe Tolliver, for the old man put upon Hale the fact that the sheriff had sneaked into his house when he was away and taken June to court, and that was the crowning touch of bitterness in his growing hatred for the captain of the guard of whom he had once been so fond. "Course you had to tell the truth, baby, when they got you there," he said kindly. "But kidnappin' you that-a-way?" He shook his great bushy head from side to side and dropped it into his hands. "I reckon that damn Hale was the man who found out that you heard Rufe say that. I'd like to know how. I'd like to get my hands on the feller as told him." June opened her lips in simple justice to clear Hale of that charge, but she saw such a terrified appeal in her stepmother's face that she kept her peace, let Hale suffer for that too, and walked out into her garden. Never once had her piano been opened, her books had lain unread, and from her lips during those days came no song. When she was not at work, she was brooding in her room, or she would walk down to Uncle Billy's and sit at the mill with him while the old man would talk in tender helplessness, or under the honeysuckle vines with old Hon, whose brisk kindness was of little avail. And then, still silent, she would get warily up and as quietly go away while the two old friends, worried to the heart, followed her sadly with their eyes. At other times she was brooding in her room or sitting in her garden, where she was now and where she found most comfort. the garden that Hale had planted for her, where purple asters leaned against lilac shrubs that would flower for the first time the coming spring, where a late rose bloomed, and marigolds drooped, and great sunflowers nodded, and giant castor plants stretched out their hands of Christ. And while June thus waited the passing of the days, many things became clear to her, for the grim finger of reality had torn the veil from her eyes and let her see herself but little changed at the depth by contact with John Hale's world, as she now saw him but little changed at the depth by contact with hers. Slowly she came to see, too, that it was his presence in the courtroom that made her tell the truth, reckless of the consequences. And she came to realize that she was not leaving the mountains because she would go to no place where she could not know of any danger that in the present crisis might threaten John Hale. And Hale saw only that in the courtroom she had drawn her skirts aside, that she had looked at him once and then had brushed past his helping hand. It put him in torment to think of what her life must be now, and of how she must be suffering. He knew that she would not leave her father in the crisis that was at hand, and after it was all over, what then? His hands would still be tied, and he would be even more helpless than he had ever dreamed possible. To be sure, an old land deal had come to life just after the discovery of the worthlessness of the mine in Lonesome Cove, and was holding out another hope. But if that, too, should fail, or if it should succeed, what then? Old Judd had sent back with a curt refusal the last allowance he forwarded to June, and he knew the old man was himself in straits. So June must stay in the mountains, and what would become of her? She had gone back to her mountain garb. Would she lapse into her old life and ever again be content? Yes, she would lapse, but never enough to keep her from being unhappy all her life. And at that thought he groaned. Thus far he was responsible, and the paramount duty with him had been that she should have the means to follow the career she had planned for herself outside of those hills. And now, if he had the means, he was helpless. There was nothing for him to do now but to see that the law had its way with Rufe Tolliver, and meanwhile he let the reawakened land deal go hang and set himself the task of finding out who it was that had ambushed old Dave Tolliver. So even when he was thinking of June, his brain was busy on that mystery, and one night as he sat brooding, a suspicion flushed that made him grip his chair with both hands and rise to pace the porch. Old Dave had been shot at dawn, and the night before the Red Fox had been absent from the guard and had not turned up until nearly noon the next day. He had told Hale that he was going home. 2 days later, Hale heard by accident that the old man had been seen near the place of the ambush about sunset of the day before the tragedy, which was on his way home, and he now learned straightway for himself that the Red Fox had not been home for a month, which was only one of his ways of mistreating the patient little old woman in black. A little while later, the Red Fox gave it out that he was trying to ferret out the murderer himself, and several times he was seen near the place of ambush looking, as he said, for evidence. But this did not halt Hale's suspicions, for he recalled that the night he had spent with the Red Fox, long ago, the old man had burst out against old Dave and had quickly covered up his indiscretion with a pious characterization of himself as a man that kept peace with both factions. And then why had he been so suspicious and fearful when Hale told him that night that he had seen him talking with a Falin in town the court day before? And had he disclosed the whereabouts of Rufe Tolliver and guided the guard to his hiding place simply for the reward? He had not yet come to claim it, and his indifference to money was notorious through the hills. Apparently, there was some general enmity in the old man toward the whole Tolliver clan, and maybe he had used the reward to fool Hale as his real motive. And then Hale quietly learned that long ago the Tollivers bitterly opposed the Red Fox's marriage to a Tolliver, that Rufe, when a boy, was always teasing the Red Fox and had once made him dance in his moccasins to the tune of bullets spitting about his feet. and that the Red Fox had been heard to say that old Dave had cheated his wife out of her just inheritance of wild land. But all that was long, long ago, and apparently had been mutually forgiven and forgotten. But it was enough for Hale, and one night he mounted his horse, and at dawn he was at the place of ambush, with his horse hidden in the bushes. The rocks for the ambush were waist high, and the twigs that had been thrust in the crevices between them were withered, and there, on the hypothesis that the Red Fox was the assassin, Hale tried to put himself after the deed into the Red Fox's shoes. The old man had turned up on the guard before noon. Then he must have gone somewhere first, or have killed considerable time in the woods. He would not have crossed the road, for there were 2 horses on the other side. There would have been no object in going on over the mountain unless he meant to escape, and if he had gone over there for another reason, he would hardly have had time to get to the courthouse before noon. Nor would he have gone back along the road on that side, for on that side, too, was a cabin not far away. So Hale turned and walked straight away from the road, where the walking was easiest, down a ravine and pushing this way and that through the bushes, where they looked easiest. Half a mile down the ravine he came to a little brook, and there in the black earth was the faint print of a man's left foot, and in the hard crust across was the deeper print of his right, where his weight in leaping had come down hard. But the prints were made by a shoe and not by a moccasin. And then Hale recalled exultantly that the Red Fox did not have his moccasins on the morning he turned up on guard. All the while he kept a sharp lookout right and left on the ground. The Red Fox must have thrown his cartridge shell somewhere, and for that Hale was looking. Across the brook he could see the tracks no further, for he was too little of a woodsman to follow so old a trail. But as he stood behind a clump of rhododendron, wondering what he could do, he heard the crack of a dead stick down the stream, and noiselessly he moved further into the bushes. His heart thumped in the silence, the long silence that followed, for it might be a hostile Tolliver that was coming. So he pulled his pistol from his holster, made ready, and then, noiseless as a shadow, the Red Fox slipped past him along the path, in his moccasins now, with his big Winchester in his left hand. The Red Fox, too, was looking for that cartridge shell, for only the night before he had heard for the first time of the whispered suspicions against him. He was making for the blind, and Hale trembled at his luck. There was no path on the other side of the stream, and Hale could barely hear him moving through the bushes. So he pulled off his boots and, carrying them in one hand, slipped after him, watching for dead twigs, stooping under the branches or sliding sidewise through them when he had to brush between their extremities, and pausing every now and then to listen for an occasional faint sound from the Red Fox ahead. Up the ravine the old man went to a little ledge of rocks, beyond which was the blind, and when Hale saw his stooped figure slip over that and disappear, he ran noiselessly towards it, crept noiselessly to the top, and peeped carefully over to see the Red Fox with his back to him and peering into a clump of bushes hardly 10 yards away. While Hale looked, the old man thrust his hand into the bushes and drew out something that twinkled in the sun. At the moment Hale's horse nickered from the bushes, and the Red Fox slipped his hand into his pocket, crouched listening a moment, and then, step by step, backed toward the ledge. Hale rose. "I want you, Red." The old man wheeled. The wolf's snarl came, but the big rifle was too slow. Hale's pistol had flashed in his face. "Drop your gun." Paralyzed, but the picture of white fury, the old man hesitated. "Drop your gun." Slowly the big rifle was loosed and fell to the ground. "Back away. Turn around and hands up." With his foot on the Winchester, Hale felt in the old man's pockets and fished out an empty cartridge shell. Then he picked up the rifle and threw the slide. "It fits all right. March toward that horse." Without a word, the old man slouched ahead to where the big black horse was restlessly waiting in the bushes. "Climb up," said Hale. "We won't ride and tie back to town, but I'll take turns with you on the horse." The Red Fox was making ready to leave the mountains, for he had been falsely informed that Rufe was to be brought back to the county seat next day, and he was searching again for the sole bit of evidence that was out against him. And when Rufe was spirited back to the jail and was on his way to his cell, an old freckled hand was thrust between the bars of an iron door to greet him, and a voice called him by name. Rufe stopped in amazement. Then he burst out laughing. He struck then at the pallid face through the bars with his manacles and cursed the old man bitterly. Then he laughed again horribly. The two slept in adjoining cells of the same cage that night, one waiting for the scaffold and the other waiting for the trial that was to send him there. And away over the Blue Mountains, a little old woman in black sat on the porch of her cabin as she had sat patiently many and many a long day. It was time, she thought, that the Red Fox was coming home. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 28. And so while Bad Rufe Tolliver was waiting for death, the trial of the Red Fox went on, and when he was not swinging in a hammock, reading his Bible, telling his visions to his guards, and singing hymns, he was in the courthouse, giving shrewd answers to questions, or none at all, with the benevolent half of his mask turned to the juries, and the wolfish snarl of the other half showing only now and then to some hostile witness, for whom his hate was stronger than his fear for his own life. And in jail, Bad Rufe worried his enemy with the malicious humor of Satan. Now he would say, "Oh, there ain't nothin' betwixt old Red and me, nothin' at all, 'cept his iron wall." And he would drum a vicious tattoo on the thin wall with the heel of his boot. Or when he heard the creak of the Red Fox's hammock as he droned his Bible aloud, he would say to his guard outside, "'Course I don't read the Bible and preach the Word nor talk with spirits, but there's worse men than me in the world. Old Red in there, for instance." And then he would cackle like a fiend, and the Red Fox would writhe in torment and beg to be sent to another cell. And always he would daily ask the Red Fox about his trial, and ask him questions in the night, and his devilish instinct told him the day that the Red Fox, too, was sentenced to death. He saw it in the gray pallor of the old man's face, and he cackled his glee like a demon. For the evidence against the Red Fox was too strong. Where June sat as chief witness against Rufe Tolliver, John Hale sat as chief witness against the Red Fox. He could not swear it was a cartridge shell that he saw the old man pick up, but it was something that glistened in the sun, and a moment later he had found the shell in the old man's pocket. And if it had been fired innocently, why was it there, and why was the old man searching for it? He was looking, he said, for evidence of the murderer himself. That claim made, the Red Fox's lawyer picked up the big rifle and the shell. "You say, Mr. Hale, the prisoner told you, the night you spent at his home, that this rifle was rimfire?" "He did." The lawyer held up the shell. "You see, this was exploded in such a rifle." That was plain, and the lawyer shoved the shell into the rifle, pulled the trigger, took it out, and held it up again. The plunger had struck below the rim and near the center, but not quite on the center, and Hale asked for the rifle and examined it closely. "It's been tampered with," he said quietly, and he handed it to the prosecuting attorney. The fact was plain. It was a bungling job, and better proved the Red Fox's guilt. Moreover, there were only two such big rifles in all the hills, and it was proven that the man who owned the other was at the time of the murder far away. The days of brainstorms had not come then. There were no eminent alienists to prove insanity for the prisoner. Apparently he had no friends, none save the little old woman in black who sat by his side hour by hour and day by day. And the Red Fox was doomed. In the hush of the courtroom, the judge solemnly put to the gray face before him the usual question. Have you anything to say whereby sentence of death would not be pronounced on you?" "No," he said in a shaking voice, "but I have a friend here who I would like to speak for me." The judge bent his head for a moment over his bench and lifted it. "It is unusual," he said, "but under the circumstances I will grant your request. Who is your friend?" And the Red Fox made the souls of his listeners leap. "Jesus Christ," he said. The judge reverently bowed his head, and the hush of the courtroom grew deeper, when the old man fished his Bible from his pocket and calmly read such passages as might be interpreted as sure damnation for his enemies and sure glory for himself, read them until the judge lifted his hand for a halt. And so another sensation spread through the hills, and a superstitious awe of this strange new power that had come into the hills went with it hand in hand. Only while the doubting ones knew that nothing could save the Red Fox, they would wait to see if that power could really avail against the Tolliver clan. The day set for Rufe's execution was the following Monday, and for the Red Fox the Friday following, for it was well to have the whole wretched business over while the guard was there. Old Judd Tolliver, so Hale learned, had come himself to offer the little old woman in black the refuge of his roof as long as she lived, and had tried to get her to go back with him to Lonesome Cove. But it pleased the Red Fox that he should stand on the scaffold in a suit of white cap and all, as emblems of the purple and fine linen he was to put on above, and the little old woman stayed where she was, silently and without question, cutting the garments, as Hale pityingly learned, from a white tablecloth, and measuring them piece by piece with the clothes the old man wore in jail. It pleased him, too, that his body would be kept unburied 3 days, saying that he would then arise and go about preaching, and that duty, too, she would as silently and with as little question perform. Moreover, he would preach his own funeral sermon on the Sunday before Rufe's Day, and a curious crowd gathered to hear him. The Red Fox was led from jail. He stood on the porch of the jailer's house with a little table in front of him. On it lay a Bible. On the other side of the table sat a little pale-faced old woman in black, with a black sunbonnet drawn close to her face. By the side of the Bible lay a few pieces of bread. It was the Red Fox's last communion, a communion which he administered to himself, and in which there was no other soul on earth to join save that little old woman in black. And when the old fellow lifted the bread and asked the crowd to come forward to partake with him in the last sacrament, not a soul moved. Only the old woman, who had been ill-treated by the Red Fox for so many years, only she, of all the crowd, gave any answer, and she for one instant turned her face toward him. With a churlish gesture the old man pushed the bread over toward her, and with hesitating, trembling fingers she reached for it. Bob Berkeley was on the death watch that night, and as he passed Rufe's cell a wiry hand shot through the grating of his door, and as the boy sprang away the condemned man's fingers tipped the butt of the big pistol that dangled on the lad's hip. "Not this time," said Bob with a cool little laugh, and Rufe laughed too. "I was only fooling," he said. "I ain't going to hang. You hear that, Red? I ain't going to hang. But you are, Red, sure. Nobody'd risk this little finger for your old carcass, except maybe that little old woman of yours who you've treated like a hound. But my folks ain't going to see me hang." Rufe spoke with some reason. That night the Tollivers climbed the mountain, and before daybreak were waiting in the woods a mile on the north side of town, and the Falins climbed too, further along the mountains, and at the same hour were waiting in the woods a mile to the south. Back in Lonesome Cove, June Tolliver sat alone, her soul shaken and terror-stricken to the depths, and the misery that matched hers was in the heart of Hale as he paced to and fro at the county seat on guard and forging out his plans for that day under the morning stars. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 29. Day broke on the old courthouse with its black portholes, on the gray stone jail, and on a tall, topless wooden box to one side from which projected a cross beam of green oak. From the center of this beam dangled a rope that swung gently to and fro when the wind moved, and with the day a flock of little birds lighted on the bars of the condemned man's cell window, chirping through them. And when the jailer brought breakfast, he found Bad Roof cowering in the corner of his cell and wet with the sweat of fear. "Them damn birds again," he growled sullenly. "Don't lose your nerve, Rufe," said the jailer, and the old laugh of defiance came, but from lips that were dry. "Not much," he answered grimly. But the jailer noticed that while he ate, his eyes kept turning again and again to the bars, and the turnkey went away shaking his head. Rufe had told the jailer, his one friend through whom he had kept in constant communication with the Tollivers, how on the night after the shooting of Maccabee, when he laid down to sleep high on the mountainside and under some rhododendron bushes, a flock of little birds flew in on him like a gust of rain and perched over and around him, twittering at him until he had to get up and pace the woods, and how, throughout the next day, when he sat in the sun planning his escape, those birds would sweep chattering over his head and sweep chattering back again. And in that mood of despair he had said once, and only once, "Somehow I knowed this time my name was Dennis," a phrase of evil prophecy he had picked up outside the hills. And now those same birds of evil omen had come again. He believed, right on the heels of the last sworn oath old Judd had sent him, that he would never hang. With the day, through the mountains and valley came in converging lines mountain humanity, men and women, boys and girls, children and babes in arms, all in their Sunday best, the men in jeans, slouched hats, and high boots, the women in gay ribbons and brilliant homespun, in wagons, on foot, on horses and mules, carrying man and boy, lover and sweetheart, or husband and wife and child, all moving through the crisp autumn air, past woods of russet and crimson, and along brown dirt roads, to the straggling little mountain town. A stranger would have thought that a county fair, a camp meeting, or a circus was their goal, but they were on their way to look upon the courthouse, with its black portholes, the gray stone jail, the tall wooden box, the projecting beam, and that dangling rope which, when the wind moved, swayed gently to and fro. And Hale had forged his plan. He knew that there would be no attempt at rescue until Rufe was led to the scaffold. And he knew that neither Falins nor Tollivers would come in a band. So the incoming tide flowed on the outskirts of the town, and along every road boyish policemen, who halted and disarmed every man who carried a weapon in sight. For thus John Hale would have against the pistols of the factions his own Winchesters and repeating shotguns. And the wondering people saw at the back windows of the courthouse and at the threatening portholes more youngsters manning Winchesters, more at the windows of the jailer's frame house, which joined and fronted the jail, and more still, a line of them, running all around the jail. And the old men wagged their heads in amazement and wondered if, after all, a Tolliver was not really going to be hanged. So they waited. The neighboring hills were black with people, waiting. The housetops were black with men and boys, waiting. The trees in the streets were bending under the weight of human bodies, and the jail yard fence was 3 feet deep with people hanging on it and hanging about one another's necks, all waiting. All morning they waited, silently and patiently. And now the fatal noon was hardly an hour away, and not a Falin nor a Tolliver had been seen. Every Falin had been disarmed of his Winchester as he came in, and as yet no Tolliver had entered the town, for wily old Judd had learned of Hale's tactics and had stayed outside the town for his own keen purpose. As the minutes passed, Hale was beginning to wonder whether, after all, old Judd had come to believe that the odds against him were too great, and had told the truth when he set afoot the rumor that his load of anxiety was beginning to lighten, that there was a little commotion at the edge of the courthouse, and a great red-headed figure pushed through the crowd, followed by another of like build, and as the people rapidly gave way and fell back, a line of Falins slipped through the wall and stood under the portholes, quiet, watchful, and determined. Almost at the same time the crowd fell back the other way up the street. There was the hurried trampling of feet, and on came the Tollivers, headed by Giant Judd, all armed with Winchesters, for old Judd had sent his guns in ahead. And as the crowd swept like water into any channel or alley or doorway that was open to it, Hale saw the yard emptied of everybody but the line of Falins against the wall and the Tollivers in a body but 10 yards in front of them. The people on the roofs and in the trees had not moved at all, for they were out of range. For a moment old Judd's eyes swept the windows and portholes of the courthouse, the windows of the jailer's house, the line of guards about the jail, and then they dropped to the line of Falins and glared with contemptuous hate into the leaping blue eyes of old Buck Falin. And for that moment there was silence, and that silence, and as silently as the silence itself, issued swiftly from the line of guards 12 youngsters with Winchesters, repeating shotguns, and in a minute 6 were facing the Falins and 6 facing the Tollivers, each with his shotgun at his hip. At the head of them stood Hale, his face a pale image, as hard as though cut from stone, his head bare, and his hand and his hip weaponless. In all that crowd there was not a man or a woman who had not seen or heard of him, for the power of the guard that was at his back had radiated through that wild region like ripples of water from a dropped stone, and unarmed even, he had a personal power that belonged to no other man in all those hills, though armed to the teeth. His voice rose clear, steady, commanding. The law has come here, and it has come to stay. He faced the beetling eyebrows and angry working beard of old Judd now. The Falins are here to get revenge on you Tollivers. If you attack us, I know that, but he wheeled on the Falins, understand? We don't want your help. If the Tollivers try to take that man in there, and one of you Falins draws a pistol, those guns there, waving his hands toward the jail windows, will be turned loose on you. We'll fight you both. The last words shot like bullets through his gritted teeth, and the flash of his eyes was gone. His face was calm, and as though the whole matter had been settled beyond possible interruption, he finished quietly. The condemned man wishes to make a confession and to say good-bye. In 5 minutes he will be at that window to say what he pleases. 10 minutes later he will be hanged. And he turned and walked calmly into the jailer's door. Not a Tolliver nor a Falin made a movement or a sound. Young Dave's eyes had glared savagely when he first saw Hale, for he had marked Hale for his own, and he knew that the fact was known to Hale. Had the battle begun then and there, Hale's death was sure, and Dave knew that. Hale must know that as well as he. And yet, with magnificent audacity, there he was, unarmed, personally helpless, and invested with an insulting certainty that not a shot would be fired. Not a Falin or a Tolliver even reached for a weapon, and the fact was the subtle tribute that ignorance pays intelligence when the latter is forced to deadly weapons as the last resort. For ignorance faced now belching shotguns, and was commanded by rifles on every side. Old Judd was trapped, and the Falins were stunned. Old Buck Falin turned his eyes down the line of his men with one warning glance. Old Judd whispered something to a Tolliver behind him, and a moment later the man slipped from the band and disappeared. Young Dave followed Hale's figure with a look of baffled, malignant hatred, and Bud's eyes were filled with angry tears. Between the factions the grim young men stood with their guns like statues. At once a big man with a red face appeared at one of the jailer's windows, and then came the sheriff, who began to take out the sash. Already the frightened crowd had gathered closer again, and now a hush came over it, followed by a rustling and a murmur. Something was going to happen. Faces and gun muzzles thickened at the portholes and at the windows. The line of guards turned their faces sidewise and upward. The crowd on the fence scuffled for better positions. The people in the trees craned their necks from the branches or climbed higher, and there was a great scraping on all the roofs. Even the black crowd out on the hills seemed to catch the excitement and to sway, while spots of intense blue and vivid crimson came out here and there from the blackness, when the women rose from their seats on the ground. Then sharply there was silence. The sheriff disappeared, and shut in by the sashless window as by a picture frame, and blinking in the strong light, stood a man with black hair cropped close, face pale and worn, and hands that looked white and thin. Stood Bad Roof Tolliver. He was going to confess. That was the rumor. His lawyers wanted him to confess. The preacher who had been singing hymns with him all morning wanted him to confess. The man himself said he wanted to confess. And now he was going to confess. What deadly mysteries he might clear up if he would. No wonder the crowd was eager, for there was no soul there but knew his record. And what a record! His best friends put his victims no lower than 13, and there looking up at him were 3 women whom he had widowed or orphaned, while at one corner of the jail yard stood a girl in black, the sweetheart of Mockabee, for whose death Rufe was standing where he stood now. But his lips did not open. Instead, he took hold of the side of the window and looked behind him. The sheriff brought him a chair, and he sat down. Apparently he was weak, and he was going to wait a while. Would he tell how he killed one Falin in the presence of the latter's wife at a wild bee tree? How he had killed a sheriff by dropping to the ground when the sheriff fired in this way, dodging the bullet, and then shooting the officer from where he lay, supposedly dead? How he had thrown another Falin out of the courthouse window and broken his neck. The Falin was drunk, Rufe always said, and fell out. Why, then, he was constable. He had killed another because, Rufe said, he resisted arrest. How and where he had killed Redneck Johnson, who was found out in the woods. Would he tell all that and more? If he meant to tell, there was no sign. His lips kept closed, and his bright black eyes were studying the situation. The little squads of youngsters, back to back, with their repeating shotguns, the line of Falins along the wall toward whom protruded 6 shining barrels, the huddled crowd of Tollivers toward whom protruded 6 more, old Judd towering in front with young Dave on one side, tense as a leopard about to spring, and on the other Bub with tears streaming down his face. In a flash he understood, and in that flash his face looked as though he had been suddenly struck a heavy blow by someone from behind. And then his elbows dropped on the sill of the window, his chin dropped into his hands, and a murmur arose. Maybe he was too weak to stand and talk. Perhaps he was going to talk from his chair. Yes, he was leaning forward, and his lips were opening, but no sound came. Slowly his eyes wandered around at the waiting people, in the trees, on the roofs, and the fence, and then they dropped to old Judd's and blazed their appeal for a sign. With one heave of his mighty chest, old Judd took off his slouch hat, pressed one big hand to the back of his head, and, despite that blazing appeal, kept it there. At that moment, Rufe threw his head up as though his breath had suddenly failed him. His face turned sickening white, and slowly again his chin dropped into his trembling hands, and still unbelieving he stared his appeal. But old Judd dropped his big hand and turned his head away. The condemned man's mouth twitched once, settling into defiant calm, and then he did one kindly thing. He turned in his seat and motioned Bob Berkeley, who was just behind him, away from the window, and the boy, to humor him, stepped aside. Then he rose to his feet and stretched his arms wide. Simultaneously came the far-away crack of a rifle, and as a jet of smoke spurred above a clump of bushes on a little hill 300 yards away, Bad Roof wheeled halfway round and fell back out of sight into the sheriff's arms. Every Falin made a nervous reach for his pistol. The line of gun muzzles covering them wavered slightly, but the Tollivers stood still and unsurprised. And when Hale dashed from the door again, there was a grim smile of triumph on old Judd's face. He had kept his promise that Rufe should never hang. "Steady there," said Hale quietly, his pistol on his hip now, and the Winchester was in his left hand. "Stand where you are, everybody." There was a sound of hurrying feet within the jail. There was the clang of an iron door, the bang of a wooden one, and in 5 minutes from within the tall wooden box came the sharp click of a hatchet, and then, dully, thump! The dangling rope had tightened with a snap, and the wind swayed it no more. At his cell door, the Red Fox stood with his watch and his eyes glued to the second hand. When it had gone 3 times around its circuit, he snapped the lid with a sigh of relief and turned to his hammock and his Bible. "It's gone now," said the Red Fox. Outside, Hale still waited, and his eyes turned from the Tollivers to the Falins. 7 of the faces among them came back to him with startling distinctness, and his mind went back to the opening trouble in the county seat over the Kentucky line years before, when 8 men held one another at the points of their pistols. One face was missing, and that face belonged to Rufe Tolliver. Hale pulled out his watch. "Keep those men there," he said, pointing to the Falins, and he turned to the bewildered Tollivers. "Come on, Judd," he said kindly, "all of you." Dazed and mystified, they followed him in a body around the corner of the jail, where in a coffin that old Judd had sent as blind to his real purpose lay the remains of bad Rufe Tolliver, with a harmless bullet hole through one shoulder. Near by was a wagon, and hitched to it were 2 mules that Hale himself had provided. Hale pointed to it. "Done all I could, Judd. Take him away. I'll keep the Falins under guard until you reach the Kentucky line, so that they can't waylay you." If old Judd heard, he gave no sign. He was looking down at the face of his foster brother. His shoulder drooped, his great frame shrunken, and his iron face beaten and helpless. Again Hale spoke. "I'm sorry for all this. I'm even sorry that your man was not a better shot." The old man straightened. Then, with a gesture, he motioned young Dave to the foot of the coffin and stooped himself at the head. Past the wagon they went, the crowd giving way before them, and with the dead Tolliver on their shoulders, old Judd and young Dave passed with their followers out of sight. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cole McKinnon. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 30. The longest of her life was that day to June. The anxiety in times of war for the women who wait at home is vague, because they are mercifully ignorant of the dangers their loved ones run. But a specific issue that involves death to those loved ones has a special and poignant terror of its own. June knew her father's plan, the precise time the fight would take place, and the especial danger that was Hale's, for she knew that young Dave Tolliver had marked him with the first shot fired. Dry-eyed and white and dumb, she watched them make ready for the start that morning while it was yet dark. Dully she heard the horses snorting from the cold, the low court orders of her father, and the exciting mutterings of Bub and young Dave. Dully she watched the saddles thrown on, the pistols buckled, the Winchesters caught up, and dully she watched them file out the gate and ride away, single file, into the cold, damp mist, like ghostly figures in a dream. Once only did she open her lips, and that was to plead with her father to leave Bub at home. But her father gave her no answer, and Bub snorted his indignation. He was a man now, and his was the privilege of a man. For a while she stood listening to the ring of metal against stone that came to her more and more faintly out of the mist, and she wondered if it was really June Tolliver standing there, while father and brother and cousin were on their way to fight the law. How differently she saw these things now, for a man who deserved death, and to fight a man who was ready to die for his duty to that law. The law that guarded them and her might not perhaps guard him. The man who had planted for her the dew-drenched garden that was waiting for the sun, and had built the little room behind her for her comfort and seclusion, who had sent her to school, had never been anything but kind and just to her and to everybody, who had taught her life and, thank God, love. Was she really the June Tolliver who had gone out into the world and had held her place there, who had conquered birth and speech and customs and environment so that none could tell what they all once were, who had become a lady, the woman of the world, in manner, dress, and education, who had a gift of music and voice that might enrich her life beyond any dream that had ever sprung from her own brain or any that she had ever caught from Hale's? Was she June Tolliver, who had been and done all that, and now had come back and was slowly sinking back into the narrow grave from which Hale had lifted her? It was all too strange and bitter. But if she wanted proof, there was her stepmother's voice now, the same old querulous, nerve-wracking voice that had embittered her all her childhood, calling her down into the old mean round of drudgery that had bound forever the horizon of her narrow life, just as it now was shutting down like a sky of brass around her own. And when the voice came, instead of bursting into tears as she was about to do, she gave a hard little laugh, and she lifted a defiant face to the rising sun. There was a limit to the sacrifice for kindred, brother, father, home, and that limit was the eternal sacrifice, the eternal undoing of herself. When this wretched, terrible business was over, she would set her feet where that sun could rise on her, busy with the work that she could do in the world for which she felt she was born. Swiftly she did the morning chores, and then she sat on the porch thinking and waiting. Spinning wheel, loom, and darning needle were to lie idle that day. The old stepmother had gotten from bed and was dressing herself, miraculously cured of a sudden, miraculously active. She began to talk of what she needed in town, and June said nothing. She went out to the stable and led out the old sorrel mare. She was going to the hanging. "Don't you want to go to town, June?" "No," said June fiercely. "Well, you needn't get mad about it. I got to go some day this week, and I reckon I might as well go terday." June answered nothing, but in silence watched her get ready, and in silence watched her ride away. She was glad to be left alone. The sun had flooded Lonesome Cove now with a light as rich and yellow as though it were late afternoon, and she could yet tell every tree by the different color of the banner that each yet definitely flung into the face of death. The yard fence was festooned with dewy cobwebs, and every weed in the field was hung with them, as with flashing jewels of exquisitely delicate design. Hale had once told her that they meant rain. Far away the mountains were overhung with purple so deep that the very air looked like mist, and a peace that seemed mother-like in tenderness brooded over the earth. Peace! Peace with a man on his way to the scaffold only a few miles away, and two bodies of men, one led by her father, the other by the man she loved, ready to fly at each other's throats, the one to get the condemned man alive, the other to see that he died. She got up with a groan. She walked into the garden. The grass was tall, tangled, and withering, and in it dead leaves lay everywhere, stems up, stems down, in reckless confusion. The scarlet sage pods were brown, and seeds were drooping from their tiny, gaping mouths. The marigolds were frost-nipped, and one lonely, black-winged butterfly was vainly searching them one by one for the lost sweets of summer. The gorgeous crowns of the sunflowers were nothing but grotesque black mummy heads set on lean, dead bodies, and the clump of big castor plants, buffeted by the wind, leaned this way and that, like giants in a drunken orgy trying to keep one another from falling down. The blight that was on the garden was the blight that was in her heart, and two bits of cheer only she found. One yellow nasturtium, scarlet-flecked, whose fragrance was a memory of the spring that was long gone, and one little cedar tree that had caught some dead leaves in its green arms was firmly holding them, as though to promise that another spring would surely come. With the flower in her hand she started up the ravine to her dreaming place, but it was so lonely up there, and she turned back. She went into her room and tried to read. Mechanically she half opened the lid of the piano and shut it, horrified by her own act. As she passed out on the porch again, she noticed it was only 9 o'clock. She turned and watched the long hand. How long a minute was! 3 hours more! She shivered and went inside and got her bonnet. She could not be alone when the hour came, and she started down the road toward Uncle Billy's mill. Hale, Hale, Hale! The name began to ring in her ears like a bell. The little shacks he had built up the creek were deserted and gone to ruin, and she began to wonder, in the light of what her father had said, how much of a tragedy that meant to him. Here was the spot where he was fishing that day, when she had slipped down behind him and he had turned and seen her for the first time. She could recall his smile and the very tone of his kind voice. "Howdy, little girl," and the cat had got her tongue. She remembered when she had written her name after she had first kissed him at the foot of the beech, June Hale, and by a grotesque mental leap the beating of his name in her brain now made her think of the beating of hailstone on her father's roof one night when as a child she had lain and listened to them. Then she noticed that the autumn shadows seemed to make the river darker than the shadows of spring, or was it already the stain of dead leaves? Hale could have told her. Those leaves were floating through the shadows, and when the wind moved, others zigzagged softly down to join them. The wind was helping them on the water too, and along came one brown leaf that was shaped like a tiny trireme, its stem acting like a rudder and keeping it straight before the breeze, so that it swept past the rest as a yacht that she was once on had swept past a fleet of fishing sloops. She was not unlike that swift little ship, and 30 yards ahead were rocks and shallows where it and the whole fleet would turn topsy-turvy. Would her own triumph be as short, and the same fate be hers? There was no question as to that, unless she took the wheel of her fate in her own hands and with them steered the ship. Thinking hard, she walked on slowly, with her hands behind her and her eyes bent on the road. What should she do? She had no money, her father had none to spare, and she could accept no more from Hale. Once she stopped and stared with unseeing eyes at the blue sky, and once under the heavy helplessness of it all, she dropped on the side of the road and sat with her head buried in her arms. Sat so long that she rose with a start and, with an apprehensive look at the mountain sun, hurried on. She would go to the Gap and teach, and then she knew that if she went there it would be on Hale's account. Very well, she would not blind herself to that fact. She would go, and perhaps all would be made up between them, and then she knew that if that but happened, nothing else could matter. When she reached the miller's cabin, she went to the porch without noticing that the door was closed. Nobody was at home, and she turned listlessly. When she reached the gate, she heard the clock beginning to strike, and with one hand on her breast, she breathlessly listened, counting 8, 9, 10, 11, and her heart seemed to stop in the fraction of time that she waited for it to strike once more. But it was only 11, and she went on down the road slowly, still thinking hard. The old miller was leaning back in a chair against the long side of the mill, with his dusty slouched hat down over his eyes. He did not hear her coming, and she thought he must be asleep, but he looked up with a start when she spoke, and she knew of what he too had been thinking. Keenly his old eyes searched her white face, and without a word he got up and reached for another chair within the mill. "You set right down now, baby," he said, and he made a pretense of having something to do inside the mill, while June watched the creaking old wheel dropping the sun-shot sparkling water into the swift sluice, but hardly seeing it at all. By and by Uncle Billy came outside and sat down, and neither spoke a word. Once June saw him covertly looking at his watch, and she put both hands to her throat, stifled. "What time is it, Uncle Billy?" She tried to ask the question calmly, but she had to try twice before she could speak at all, and when she did get the question out, her voice was only a broken whisper. 5 minutes to 12, baby," said the old man, and his voice had a gulp in it that broke June down. She sprang to her feet, wringing her hands. I can't stand it, Uncle Billy," she cried madly, and with a sob that almost broke the old man's heart. "I tell you, I can't stand it." And yet for 3 hours more she had to stand it, while the cavalcade of Tollivers, with Rufe's body, made its slow way to the Kentucky line, where Judd and Dave and Bud left them to go home for the night and be on hand for the funeral the next day. But Uncle Billy led her back to his cabin, and on the porch the two, with old Hon, waited while the 3 hours dragged along. It was June who first heard the galloping of horses' hoofs up the road, and she ran to the gate, followed by Uncle Billy, an old Hun, to see Dave Tolliver coming in a run. At the gate he threw himself from his horse. "Get up there, June, and go home," he panted sharply. June flashed out the gate. "Have you done it?" she asked with deadly quiet. "Hurry up and go home, I tell you. Uncle Judd wants ye." She came quite close to him now. "You said you'd do it. I know what you've done. You—" She looked as if she would fly at his throat, and Dave, amazed, shrank back a step. "Go home, I tell you. Uncle Judd's shot. Get on the horse." "No, no, no, I won't touch anything that was yours." She put her hands to her head as though she were crazed, and then she turned and broke into a swift run up the road. Panting, June reached the gate. The front door was closed, and there she gave a tremulous cry for Bub. The door opened a few inches, and through it Bub shouted for her to come on. The back door, too, was closed, and not a ray of daylight entered the room except at the porthole where Bub, with a Winchester, had been standing on guard. By the light of the fire she saw her father's giant frame stretched out on the bed, and she heard his labored breathing. Swiftly she went to the bed and dropped on her knees beside it. "Dad," she said. The old man's eyes opened and turned heavily toward her. "All right, Junie. They shot me from the Laurel, and then they might nigh got Bub. I reckon they've got me this time." "No, no." He saw her eyes fixed on the matted blood on his chest. "His stop. I'm afraid he's bleeding inside." His voice had dropped to a whisper and his eyes closed again. There was another cautious hello outside, and when Bub again opened the door, Dave ran swiftly within. He paid no attention to June. "I followed June back and left my horse in the bushes. There was 3 of 'em." He showed Bub a bullet hole through one sleeve, and then he turned half contemptuously to June. "I ain't done it," adding grimly, "not yet. He's as safe as you air. I hope you're satisfied that hit hain't him 'stead your daddy there." "Are you going to the Gap for a doctor?" "I reckon I can't leave Bub here alone agin all them Falins, not even to git a doctor or carry a love message fer you." "Then I'll go myself." A thick protest came from the bed, and then an appeal that might have come from a child. "Don't leave me, Junie." Without a word June went into the kitchen and got the old bark horn. "Uncle Billy will go," she said, and she stepped out on the porch. But Uncle Billy was already on his way, and she heard him coming just as she was raising the horn to her lips. She met him at the gate, and without even taking the time to come into the house, the old miller hurried upward towards the Lonesome Pine. The rain came then, the rain that the tiny cobwebs had heralded at dawn that morning. The old stepmother had not come home, and June told Bub she had gone over the mountain to see her sister, and when, as darkness fell, she did not appear, they knew that she must have been caught by the rain and would spend the night with a neighbor. June asked no question, but from the low talk of Bub and Dave she made out what had happened in town that day, and a wild elation settled in her heart that John Hale was alive and unhurt, though Rufe was dead, her father wounded, and Bub and Dave both had but narrowly escaped the Falin assassins that afternoon. Bub took the first turn at watching while Dave slept, and when it was Dave's turn she saw him drop quickly asleep in his chair, and she was left alone with the breathing of the wounded man and the beating of the rain on the roof. And through the long night June thought her brain weary over herself, her life, her people, and Hale. They were not to blame, her people. They but did as their fathers had done before them. They had their own code, and they lived up to it as best they could, and they had no chance to learn another. She felt the vindictive hatred that had prolonged the feud. Had she been a man, she could not have rested until she had slain the man who had ambushed her father. She expected Bub to do that now, and if the spirit was so strong in her with the training she had had, how helpless they must be against it. Even Dave was not to blame for loving her. He had always done that. For that reason he could not help hating Hale, and how great a reason he had now, for he could not understand, as she could, the absence of any personal motive that had governed him in the prosecution of the law, no matter if he hurt friend or foe. But for Hale, she would have loved Dave and now been married to him and happier than she was. Dave saw that. No wonder he hated Hale. And as she slowly realized all these things, she grew calm and gentle and determined to stick to her people and do the best she could with her life. And now and then through the night, old Judd would open his eyes and stare at the ceiling, and at these times it was not the pain in his face that distressed her as much as the drawn, beaten look that she had noticed growing in it for a long time. It was terrible, that helpless look in the face of a man, so big in body, so strong of mind, so iron-like in will. And whenever he did speak, she knew what he was going to say. "It's all over, Junie. They've beat us on every turn. They've got us one by one. There ain't but a few of us left now, and when I get up, if I ever do, I'm goin' to gather 'em all together, pull up stakes and take 'em all west. You won't ever leave me, Junie?" "No, Dad," she would say gently. He had asked the question at first quite sanely, but as the night wore on and the fever grew and his mind wandered, he would repeat the question over and over like a child. And over, while Bub and Dave slept and the rain poured, June would repeat her answer, "I'll never leave you, Dad." End chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cole McKinnon. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 31. Before dawn, Hale and the doctor and the old miller had reached the pine, and there Hale stopped. Any farther, the old man told him, he would go only at the risk of his life from Dave or Bub, or even from any Falin who happened to be hanging around in the bushes, for Hale was hated equally by both factions now. "I'll wait up here until noon, Uncle Billy," said Hale, "and ask her, for God's sake, to come up here and see me." "All right, I'll ax her. But—" The old miller shook his head. Breakfastless, except for the munching of a piece of chocolate, Hale waited all the morning with his black horse in the bushes, some 30 yards from the Lonesome Pine. Every now and then he would go to the tree and look down the path, and once he slipped far down the trail and aside to a spur whence he could see the cabin in the cove. Once his hungry eyes caught sight of a woman's figure walking through the little garden, and for an hour after it disappeared into the house he watched for it to come out again. But nothing more was visible, and he turned back to the trail to see Uncle Billy laboriously climbing up the slope. Hale waited and ran down to meet him, his face and eyes eager and his lips trembling, but again Uncle Billy was shaking his head. "No use, John," he said sadly. "I got her out on the porch and axed her, but she won't come." "She won't come at all?" "John, when one of them Tollivers gets white about the mouth, and their eyes gets to blazin', and they keeps quiet, they're plumb out o' reach of the Almighty himself. June skeered me, but you mustn't blame her jest now. You see, you got up that guard. You ketched Rufe and hung him, and she caught up thinkin' if you hadn't done that, her old daddy wouldn't be in there on his back nigh to death. You mustn't blame her, John. She's most out o' her head now." "All right, Uncle Billy. Goodbye." Hale turned, climbed sadly back to his horse, and sadly dropped down the other side of the mountain and on through the rocky gap home. A week later he learned from the doctor that the chances were even that old Judd would get well, but the days went by with no word of June. Through those days June wrestled with her love for Hale and her loyalty to her father, who, sick as he was, seemed to have a vague sense of the trouble within her, and shrewdly fought it by making her daily promise that she would never leave him. For as old Judd got better, June's fierceness against Hale melted, and her love came out the stronger, because of the passing injustice that she had done him. Many times she was on the point of sending him word that she would meet him at the Pine, but she was afraid of her own strength if she could see him face to face, and she feared she would be risking his life if she allowed him to come. There were times when she would have gone to him herself, had her father been well and strong, but he was old, beaten, and helpless, and she had given her sacred word that she would never leave him. So once more she grew calmer, gentler still, and more determined to follow her own way with her own kin, though that way led through a breaking heart. She never mentioned Hale's name. She never spoke of going west, and in time Dave began to wonder not only if she had not gotten over her feeling for Hale, but if that feeling had not turned into a permanent hate. To him, June was kinder than ever, because she understood him better, and because she was sorry for the hunted, hounded life he led, not knowing, when on his trips to see her or to do some service for her father, he might be picked off by some Falin from the bushes. So Dave stopped his sneering remarks against Hale and began to dream his old dreams, though he never opened his lips to June, and she was unconscious of what was going on within him. By and by, as old Judd began to mend, overtures of peace came, singularly enough, from the Falins, and while the old man snorted with contemptuous disbelief at them as a pretense to throw him off his guard, Dave began to actually believe that they were sincere, and straightway forged a plan of his own, even if the Tollivers did persist in going west. So one morning, as he mounted his horse at old Judd's gate, he called to June in the garden. "I'm a-goin' over the gap." June paled, but Dave was not looking at her. "What for?" she asked, steadying her voice. "Business," he answered, and he laughed curiously, and still without looking at her, he rode away. Hale sat in the porch of his little office that morning, and the Honorary Sam Budd, who had risen to leave, stood with his hands deep in his pockets, his hat tilted far over his big goggles, looking down at the dead leaves that floated like lost hopes on the placid mill pond. Hale had agreed to go to England once more on the sole chance left him before he went back to Chain and Compass, the old land deal that had come to life, and between them they had about enough money for the trip. "You'll keep an eye on things over there," said Hale, with a backward motion of his head toward Lonesome Cove, and the Honorable Sam nodded his head. "All I can." "Those big trunks of hers are still here." The Honorable Sam smiled. "She won't need 'em. I'll keep an eye on 'em, and she can come over and get what she wants every year or two," he added grimly, and Hale groaned. "Stop it, Sam." "All right. You ain't goin' to try to see her before you leave?" And then at the look on Hale's face he said hurriedly, all right," and with a toss of his hands turned away, while Hale sat thinking where he was. Rufe Tolliver had been quite right as to the Red Fox. Nobody would risk his life for him. There was no one to attempt a rescue, and but a few of the guards were on hand this time to carry out the law. On the last day he had appeared in his white suit of tablecloth. The little old woman in black had made even the cap that was to be drawn over his face, and that too she had made of white. Moreover, she would have his body kept unburied for 3 days, because the Red Fox said that on the 3rd day he would arise and go about preaching. So that even in death the Red Fox was consistently inconsistent, and how he reconciled such a dual life at one and the same time over and under the stars was, except to his twisted brain, never known. He walked firmly up the scaffold steps and stood there blinking in the sunlight. With one hand he tested the rope. For a moment he looked at the sky and the trees with a face that was white and absolutely expressionless. Then he sang one hymn of 2 verses and quietly dropped into that world in which he believed so firmly and toward which he had trod so strange a way on earth. As he wished, the little old woman in black had the body kept unburied for 3 days, but Red Fox never rose. With his passing, law and order had become supreme. Neither Tolliver nor Falin came on the Virginia side for mischief, and the desperadoes of 2 sister states, whose skirts are stitched together with pine and pin oak along the crest of the Cumberland, confined their deviltries with great care to places long distant from the gap. John Hale had done a great work, but the limit of his activities was that state line, and the Falins, ever threatening that they would not leave a Tolliver alive, could carry out those threats, and Hale not be able to lift a hand. It was his helplessness that was making him writhe now. Old Judd had often said he meant to leave the mountains. Why didn't he go now and take June, for whose safety his heart was always in his mouth? As an officer, he was now helpless where he was, and if he went away he could give no personal aid. He would not even know what was happening, and he had promised Bud to go. An open letter was clutched in his hand, and again he read it. His coal company had accepted his last proposition. They would take his stock, worthless as they thought it, and surrender the cabin and 200 acres of field and woodland in Lonesome Cove. That much at least would be intact. But if he failed in his last project now, it would be subject to judgments against him that were sure to come. So there was one thing more to do for June before he left for the final effort in England, to give back her home to her. And as he rose to do it now, somebody shouted at his gate. "Hello!" Hale stopped short at the head of the steps. His right hand shot like a shaft of light to the butt of his pistol, stayed there, and he stood astounded. It was Dave Tolliver on horseback, and Dave's right hand had kept hold of his bridle reins. "Hold on," he said, lifting the other with a wide gesture of peace. "I want to talk with you a bit." Still, Hale watched him closely as he swung from his horse. "Come in, won't you?" The mountaineer hitched his horse and slouched within the gate. "Have a seat?" Dave dropped to the steps. "I'll set here," he said, and there was an embarrassed silence for a while between the two. Hale studied young Dave Tolliver's face from narrowed eyes. He knew all the threats the Tollivers had made against him, the bitter enmity that he felt, and that it would last until one or the other was dead. This was a queer move. The mountaineer took off his slouched hat and ran one hand through his thick black hair. "I reckon you've heard as how all our folks are sellin' out over the mountains." "No," said Hale quickly. "Well, they air, and all of 'em are goin' west. Uncle Jug, Lordy, and June, and all our kinfolks. You didn't know that?" "No," repeated Hale. "Well, they ain't closed all the trades yit," he said, "and they might not go maybe afore spring. The Falins say they air done now. Uncle Judd don't believe 'em, but I do, and I'm thinkin' I won't go. I've got a little money, and I want to know if I can't buy back Uncle Judd's house and a little ground around it. Our folks is tired of fightin', and I couldn't live on the other side of the mountain after they air gone, and keep as healthy as on this side. So I thought I'd see if I couldn't buy back June's old home, maybe, and live there." Hale watched him keenly, wondering what his game was, and he went on. "I know the house and land ain't worth much to your company, and as the coal vein has petered out, I reckon they might not ax much fer it." It was all out now, and he stopped without looking at Hale. "I ain't askin' any favors, least not of you, and I thought my share of Moss Farm might be enough to get me that house and some of the other land." "You mean to live there yourself?" "Yes." "Alone?" Dave frowned. "I reckon that's my business." "So it is. Excuse me." Hale lighted his pipe, and the mountaineer waited. He was a little sullen now. "Well, the company has parted with the land." Dave started. "Sold it?" "In a way, yes." "Well, would you mind telling me who bought it? Maybe I can get it from him." "It's mine now," said Hale quietly. "Yourn?" The mountaineer looked incredulous, and then he let loose a scornful laugh. "You gonna live there?" "Maybe." "Alone?" "That's my business." The mountaineer's face darkened, and his fingers began to twitch. "Well, if you're talking about June, it's my business. It's always been, and it's always will be." "Well, if I was talking about June, I wouldn't consult you." "No, but I'd consult you like hell." "I wish you had the chance," said Hale coolly. "But I wasn't talking about June." Again Dave laughed harshly, and for a moment his angry eyes rested on the quiet mill pond. He went backward suddenly. "You went over there in Lonesome with your high notions and your slick tongue, and you took June away from me, but she wasn't good enough for you then. So you filled her up with your fool notions and sent her away to get her poor little head filled with furrin ways so she could be fittin' to marry you. You took her away from her daddy, her family, her kinfolks, and her home, and you took her away from me. And now she's been over there eatin' her heart out, just as she ate it out over here when she first left home. And in the end she got so highfalutin that she wouldn't marry you." He laughed again, and Hale winced under the laugh and the lashing words.
and I know you air eatin' your heart out too, 'cause you can't get June, and I'm hoping you'll suffer the torment o' hell as long as you live. God, she hates you now. Think you're all knowin' the world and women and books." He spoke with vindictive and insulting slowness. "You being such a fool."
That may all be true, but I think you can talk better outside that gate. The mountaineer, deceived by Hale's calm voice, sprang to his feet in a fury, but he was too late. Hale's hand was on the butt of his revolver, his blue eyes were glittering, and a dangerous smile was at his lips. Silently he sat, and silently he pointed his other hand at the gate. Dave laughed. "Do you think I'd fight you here? If you killed me, you'd be elected county jedge. If I killed you, what chance would I have of getting away? I'd swing for it." He was outside the gate now and unhitching his horse. He started to turn the beast, but Hale stopped him. "Get on from this side, please." With one foot in the stirrup, Dave turned savagely. "Why don't you go up in the gap with me now and fight it out like a man?" "I don't trust you." "I get you over in the mountains some day. I've no doubt you will, if you have the chance from the bush." Hale was getting roused now. "Look here," he said suddenly. "You've been threatening me for a long time now. I've never had any feeling against you. I've never done anything to you that I hadn't to do. But you've gone a little too far now, and I'm tired. If you can't get over your grudge against me, suppose we go across the river outside the town limits, put our guns down and fight it out, fist and skull." "I'm your man," said Dave eagerly, looking across the street. Hale saw two men on the porch. "Come on," he said. The two men were Bud and the new town sergeant. "Sam," he said, "this gentleman and I are going across the river to have a little friendly bout, and I wish you'd come along, and you too, Bill, to see that Dave here gets fair play." The sergeant spoke to Dave. "You don't need nobody to see that you get fair play with them too, but I'll go along just the same." Hardly a word was said as the four walked across the bridge and toward the thicket to the right. Neither Bud nor the sergeant asked the nature of the trouble, for either could have guessed what it was. Dave tied his horse and, like Hale, stripped off his coat. The sergeant took charge of Dave's pistol and Bud of Hale's. "All you've got to do is keep him away from you," said Bud. "If he gets his hands on you, you're gone. You know how they fight, rough and tumble." Hale nodded. He knew all that himself, and when he looked at Dave's sturdy neck and gigantic shoulders, he knew further that if the mountaineer got him in his grasp, he would have to gasp enough in a hurry or be saved by Bud from being throttled to death. "Are you ready?" Again Hale nodded. "Go ahead, Dave," growled the sergeant, for the job was not to his liking. Dave did not plunge toward Hale as the three others expected. On the contrary, he assumed the conventional attitude of the boxer and advanced warily, using his head as a diagnostician for Hale's points, and Hale remembered suddenly that Dave had been away at school for a year. Dave knew something of the game, and the Honorable Sam straightway was anxious. When the mountaineer ducked and swung his left, Bud's heart thumped, and he almost shrank himself from the terrific sweep of the big fist. "God," he muttered, for had the fist caught Hale's head, it must, it seemed, have crushed like an eggshell. Hale coolly withdrew his head not more than an inch, it seemed to Bud's practised eye, and jabbed his right with a lightning uppercut into Dave's jaw. That made the mountaineer reel backward with a grunt of rage and pain, and when he followed it up with a swing of his left on Dave's right eye and another terrific jolt with his right on the left jaw, and Bud saw the crazy rage in the mountaineer's face, he felt easy. In that rage Dave forgot his science, as the Honorable Sam expected, and with a bellow he started at Hale like a cave-dweller to bite, tear, and throttle. But the lithe figure before him swayed this way and that like a shadow, and with every side step a fist crushed on the mountaineer's nose, chin, or jaw, until, blinded with blood and fury, Dave staggered aside toward the sergeant with a cry of a madman. "Gimme my gun! I'll kill him! Gimme my gun!" And when the sergeant sprang forward and caught the mountaineer, he dropped weeping with rage and shame to the ground. "You two just go back to town," said the sergeant. "I'll take keer of him quick," and he shook his head as Hale advanced. "He ain't going to shake hands with you." The two turned back across the bridge, and Hale went on to Bud's office to do what he was setting out to do when young Dave came. There he had the lawyer make out a deed in which the cabin in Lonesome Cove and the acres about it were conveyed in fee simple to June, her heirs and assigns forever. But the girl must not know until, Hale said, her father dies or I die or she marries. When he came out, the sergeant was passing the door. "Ain't no use fightin' with one of them fellers that-a-way," he said, shaking his head. "If he whoops you, he'll crow over you as long as he lives, and if you whoop him, he'll kill you fust chance he gets. You'll have to watch that feller as long as you live, 'specially when he's drinkin'. He'll remember that lickin' and want revenge for it till the grave. One of you has got to die some day, sure." And the sergeant was right. Dave was going through the gap at that moment, cursing, swaying like a drunken man, firing his pistol and shouting his revenge to the echoing gray walls that took up his cries and sent them shrieking on the wind up every dark ravine. All the way up the mountain he was cursing. Under the gentle voice of the big pine he was cursing still, and when his lips stopped, his heart was beating curses as he dropped down the other side of the mountain. When he reached the river, he got off his horse and bathed his mouth and his eyes again, and he cursed afresh when the blood started afresh at his lips again. For a while he sat there in his black mood, undecided whether he should go to his uncle's cabin or go on home. But he had seen a woman's figure in the garden as he came down the spur, and the thought of June drew him to the cabin in spite of his shame and the questions that were sure to be asked. When he passed around the clump of rhododendrons at the creek, June was in the garden still. She was pruning a rosebush with Bub's penknife, and when she heard him coming she wheeled, quivering. She had been waiting for him all day, and like an angry goddess she swept fiercely toward him. Dave pretended not to see her, but when he swung from his horse and lifted his sullen eyes, he shrank as though she had lashed him across them with a whip. Her eyes blazed with murderous fire from her white face. The penknife in her hand was clenched as though for a deadly purpose, and on her trembling lips was the same question that she had asked him at the mill. "Have you done it this time?" she whispered, and then she saw his swollen mouth and his battered eyes. Her fingers relaxed about the handle of the knife. The fire in her eyes went swiftly down, and with a smile that was half pity, half contempt, she turned away. She could not have told the whole truth better in words, even to Dave, as he looked after his every pulse beat was a new curse, and if at that minute he could have had Hale's heart, he would have eaten it like a savage, raw. For a minute he hesitated, with reins in hands, as to whether he should turn now and go back to the gap to settle with Hale, and then he threw the reins over a post. He could bide his time yet a little longer, for a crafty purpose suddenly entered into his brain. Bub met him at the door of the cabin, and his eyes opened. "What's the matter, Dave?" "Oh, nothin'," he said carelessly. "My horse stumbled comin' down the mountain, and I went clean over his head." He raised one hand to his mouth, and still Bub was suspicious. "Looks like you've been in a fight." The boy began to laugh, but Dave ignored him and went into the cabin. Within, he sat where he could see through the open door. "Where you been, Dave?" asked old Judd from the corner. Just then he saw June coming, and pretended to draw on his pipe. He waited until she sat down within earshot on the edge of the porch. "Who do you reckon owns this house and 200 acres of land roundabouts?" The girl's heart waited apprehensively, and she heard her father's deep voice. "The company owns it." Dave laughed harshly. "Not much. John Hale." The heart out on the porch leapt with gladness now. "He bought it from the company. It's just as well you're going away, Uncle Judd. He'd put you out." "I reckon not. I got writin' from the company, which allows me to stay here 2 years or more if I want to." "I don't know. He's a slick one." "I heerd him say," put in Bub stoutly, "that he see we stayed here just as long as we pleased." "Well," said old Judd shortly, "if we stay here by his favor, we won't stay long." There was a silence for a while. Then Dave spoke again for the listening ears outside, maliciously. "I went over to the Gap to see if I couldn't get the place myself from the company. I believe the Falins ain't going to bother us, and I ain't hankerin' to go west. But I told him
that you all was goin' to leave the mountains and goin' out there for good." There was another silence. He never said a word. Nobody had asked the question, but he was answering the unspoken one in the heart of June, and that heart sank like a stone. "He's goin' away himself, goin' tomorrow, goin' to that same place he went before. England, some fella called it." Dave had done his work well. June rose unsteadily, and with one hand on her heart and the other clutching the railing of the porch, she crept noiselessly along it, staggered like a wounded thing around the chimney, through the garden and on, still clutching her heart, to the woods, there to sob it out on the breast of the only mother she had ever known. Dave was gone when she came back from the woods, calm, dry-eyed, pale. Her stepmother had kept her dinner for her, and when she said she wanted nothing to eat, the old woman answered something querulous, to which June made no answer, but went quietly to cleaning away the dishes. For a while she sat on the porch, and presently she went into her room, and for a few moments she rocked quietly at her window. Hale was going away the next day, and when he came back she would be gone, and she would never see him again. A dry sob shook her body of a sudden. She put both hands to her head, and with wild eyes she sprang to her feet, and catching up her bonnet, slipped noiselessly out the back door. With hands clenched tight, she forced herself to walk slowly across the footbridge, but when the bushes hid her, she broke into a run as though she were crazed and escaping a madhouse. At the foot of the spur she turned swiftly up the mountain and climbed madly with one hand tight against the little cross at her throat. He was going away, and she must tell him. She must tell him. What? Behind her a voice was calling, the voice that pleaded all one night for her not to leave him, that had made that plea a daily prayer, and it had come from an old man, wounded, broken in health and heart, and her father. Hale's face was before her, but that voice was behind her, and as she climbed, the face she was nearing grew fainter. The voice she was leaving sounded the louder in her ears, and when she reached the big pine she dropped helplessly at the base of it, sobbing. With her tears, the madness slowly left her, the old determination came back, and at last the old sad peace. The sunlight was slanting at a low angle when she rose to her feet and stood on the cliff overlooking the valley. Her lips parted as when she stood there first, and the tiny drops drying along the roots of her dull gold hair. And, being there for the last time, she thought of that time when she was first there, ages ago. The great glare of light that she looked for then had come and gone. There was the smoking monster rushing into the valley and sending echoing shrieks through the hills, but there was no booted stranger, and no horse issuing from the covert of maple where the path disappeared. A long time she stood there, with a wandering look of farewell to every familiar thing before her, but not a tear came now. Only as she turned away at last, her breast heaved and fell with one long breath. That was all. Passing the pine slowly, she stopped and turned back to it, unclasping the necklace from her throat. With trembling fingers she detached it from the little luck piece that Hale had given her, the tear of a fairy that had turned into a tiny cross of stone when a strange messenger brought to the Virginia Valley the story of the crucifixion. The penknife was still in her pocket, and, opening it, she went behind the pine and dug a niche as high and as deep as she could towards its soft heart. In there she thrust the tiny symbol, whispering, "I want all the luck you could ever give me, little cross, for him." Then she pulled the fibers down to cover it from sight, and, crossing her hands over the opening, she put her forehead against them and touched her lips to the tree. "Keep it safe, old pine." Then she lifted her face, looking upward along its trunk to the blue sky. "And bless him, dear God, and guard him evermore." She clutched her heart as she turned, and she was clutching it when she passed into the shadows below, leaving the old pine to whisper, when he passed, her love. Next day the word went around to the clan that the Tollivers would start in a body 1 week later for the west. At daybreak that morning, Uncle Billy and his wife mounted the old gray horse and rode up the river to say goodbye. They found the cabin in the Lonesome Cove deserted. Many things were left piled in the porch. The Tollivers had left apparently in a great hurry, and the two old people were much mystified.
Not until noon did they learn what the matter was. Only the night before, a Tolliver had shot a Falin, and the Falins had gathered to get revenge on Judd that night. The warning word had been brought to the Lonesome Cove by Loretta Tolliver, and it had come straight from young Buck Falin himself. So June and old Judd and Bub had fled in the night. At that hour they were on their way to the railroad, old Judd at the head of his clan, his right arm still bound to his side, his bushy beard low on his breast, June and Bub on horseback behind him, the rest strung out behind them, and in a wagon at the end, with all of her household effects, the little old woman in black, who would wait no longer for the Red Fox to arise from the dead. Loretta alone was missing. She was on her way with young Buck Falin to the railroad on the other side of the mountains. Between them, not a living soul disturbed the dead stillness of Lonesome Cove. End chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cole McKinnon. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 32. All winter the cabin in Lonesome Cove slept through the rain and sleet and snow, and no foot passed its threshold. Winter broke, floods came, and warm sunshine. A pale green light stole through the trees, shy, ethereal, and so like a mist that it seemed at any moment on the point of floating upward. Color came with the wild flowers, and song with the wood thrush. Squirrels played on the tree trunks like mischievous children. The brooks sang like happy human voices through the tremulous underworld, and woodpeckers hammered out the joy of spring. But the awakening only made the desolate cabin lonelier still. After 3 warm days in March, Uncle Billy, the miller, rode up the creek with a hoe over his shoulder. He had promised this to Hale, for his labor of love in June's garden. Weeping April passed. May came with a rosy face uplifted, and with the birth of June the laurel emptied its pink-flecked cup, and the rhododendron blazed the way for summer's coming with white stars. Back to the hills came Hale then, and with all their rich beauty they were as desolate as when he left them, bare with winter, for his mission had miserably failed. His train creaked and twisted around the benches of the mountains, and up and down ravines, into the hills. The smoke rolled in as usual through the windows and doors. There was the same crowd of children, slatternly women, and tobacco-spitting men in the dirty day coaches, and Hale sat among them, for a pullman was no longer attached to the train that ran to the Gap. As he neared the bulk of Powell's Mountain and ran along its mighty flank, he passed the ore mines. At each one the commissary was closed. The cheap, dingy little houses stood empty on the hillsides, and every now and then he would see a tipple and an empty car, left as it was after dumping its last load of red ore. On the right, as he approached the station, the big furnaces stood like a dead giant, still and smokeless, and the piles of pig iron were red with rust. The same little dummy wheezed him into the dead little town. Even the face of the Gap was a little changed by the gray scar that man had slashed across its mouth, getting limestone for the groaning monster of a furnace that was now at peace. The streets were deserted. A new face fronted him at the desk of the hotel, and the eyes of the clerk showed no knowledge of him when he wrote his name. His supper was coarse, greasy, and miserable. His room was cold. Steam heat, it seemed, had been given up. The sheets were ill-smelling, the mouth of the pitcher was broken, and the one towel had seen much previous use. But the water was the same, as was the cool, pungent night air, both blessed of God, and they were the sole comforts that were his that night. The next day it was as though he were arranging his own funeral, but with little hope of a resurrection. The tax collector met him when he came downstairs, having seen his name on the register. "You know," he said, "I'll have to add 5% next month." Hale smiled. "That won't be much more," he said, and the collector, a new one, laughed good-naturedly and with understanding turned away. Mechanically he walked to the club, but there was no club. Then to the office of the Progress, the paper that was the boast of the town. The Progress was defunct, and the brilliant editor had left the hills. A boy with an ink-smeared face was setting type, and a pallid gentleman with glasses was languidly working a hand-press. A pile of fresh-smelling papers lay on a table, and after a question or two he picked up one. 2 of its 4 pages were covered with announcement of suits and sales to satisfy judgments, the printing of which was the raison d'etre of the noble sheet. Down the column his eye caught John Hale et al., John Hale et al., and he wondered why the others should be so persistently anonymous. There was a cloud of them, thicker than the smoke of coke ovens. He had breathed that thickness for a long time, but he got a fresh sense of suffocation now. Towards the post office he moved. Around the corner he came upon one of the 2 brothers whom he remembered as carpenters. He recalled his inability once to get that gentleman to hang a door for him. He was a carpenter again now, and he carried a saw and a plane. There was a grim humor in the situation. The carpenter's brother had gone, and he himself could hardly get enough work, he said, to support his family. "Going to start that house of yours?" "I think not," said Hale. "Well, I'd like to get a contract for a chicken coop just to keep my hand in." There was more. A 2-horse wagon was coming with 2 cottage organs aboard. In the mouth of the slouch-hat, unshaven driver was a corn-cob pipe. He pulled in when he saw Hale. "Hello!" he shouted, grinning. Good heavens! Was that uncouth figure the valuable, buoyant, flashy magnate of the old days? It was. "Sellin' organs again," he said briefly. "And teachin' singin' school?" The dethroned king of finance grinned. "Sure. What you doin'?" "Nothin'." "Goin' to stay long?" "No." "Well, see you again. So long. Get up." Wheel spokes whirred in the air, and he saw a buggy, with the top down, rattling down another streak, in a cloud of dust. It was the same buggy in which he had first seen the black-bearded senator 7 years before. It was the same horse, too, and the Arab-like face and the bushy black whiskers, save for the streaks of gray, were the same. This was the man who used to buy watches and pianos by the dozen, who one Christmas gave a present to every living man, woman, and child in the town, and under whose colossal schemes the pillars of the church throughout the state stood as supports. That far away the eagle-nosed face looked haggard, haunted, and all but spent, and even now he struck Hale as being driven downward like a madman by the same relentless energy that once had driven him upward. It was the same story everywhere. Nearly everybody who could get away was gone. Some of these were young enough to profit by the lesson and take surer root elsewhere. Others were too old for transplanting, and of them would be heard no more. Others stayed for the reason that getting away was impossible. These were living, visible tragedies, still hopeful, pathetically unaware of the leading parts they were playing, and still weakly waiting for a better day, or sinking, as by gravity, back to the old trades they have practiced before the boom. A few sturdy souls, the fittest, survived, undismayed. Logan was there, lawyer for the railroad and the coal company. McFarland was a judge, and 2 or 3 others, too, had come through unscathed in spirit and undaunted in resolution, but gone were the young blue-grass Kentuckians, the young Tidewater Virginians, the New England school teachers, the bankers, real estate agents, engineers. Gone the gamblers, the wily Jews, and the vagrant women that fringed the incoming tide of new prosperity. Gone, all gone. Beyond the post office he turned toward the red brick house that sat above the mill pond. Eagerly he looked for the old mill, and he stopped in physical pain. The dam had been torn away, the old wheel was gone, and a caved-in roof and supporting walls, drunkenly aslant, were the only remnants left. A red-haired child stood at the gate before the red brick house, and Hale asked her a question. The little girl had never heard of the Widow Crane. Then he walked toward his old office and bedroom. There was a voice inside his old office when he approached. A tall figure filled the doorway. A pair of great googles beamed on him like beacon lights in a storm, and the Honorable Sam Budd's hand and his were clasped over the gate. "It's all over, Sam. Don't you worry. Come on in." The 2 sat on the porch. Below it, the dimpled river shone through the rhododendrons, and with his eyes fixed on it, the Honorable Sam slowly approached the thought of each. The old cabin in Lonesome Cove is just as the Tollivers left it. None of them ever came back? Bud shook his head. No, but one's comin'. Dave. Dave? Yes, and you know what for? I suppose so, said Hale carelessly. Did you send old Judd the deed? Sure, along with that fool condition of yours that June shouldn't know until he was dead, or she married. I never heard a word. Do you suppose he'll stick to the condition? He has stuck, said the Honorable Sam shortly. Otherwise you would have heard from June. I'm not going to be here long, said Hale. Where are you going? I don't know. Bud puffed his pipe. Well, you are here. You want to keep your eye peeled for Dave Tolliver? I told you that the mountaineer hates as long as he remembers, and that he never forgets. Do you know that Dave Tolliver sent his horse back to the stable here to be hired out for his keep, and told it right and left that when you came back he was coming too, and he was going to straddle that horse until he found you, and then one of you had to die. How he found out you were coming about this time I don't know, but he has sent word that he'll be here. Looks like he hasn't made much headway with June. I'm not worried. Well, you better be, said Bud sharply. Did Uncle Billy plant the garden? Flowers and all, just as June always had 'em. He's always had the idea that June would come back. Maybe she will. Not on your life. She might if you went out there for her. Hale looked up quickly and slowly shook his head. Look here, Jack. You're seeing things wrong. You can't blame that girl for losing her head after you spoiled and pampered her the way you did. And with all her sense, it was mighty hard for her to understand you being arrayed against her flesh and blood, law or no law. That mountain's nature pure and simple, and it comes mighty near being human nature the world over. You never gave her a square chance. You know what Uncle Billy said? Yes, and I know Uncle Billy changed his mind. Go after her. No, said Hale firmly. It'll take me 10 years to get out of debt. I wouldn't now if I could, on her account. Nonsense. Hale rose. I'm going over to take a look around and get some things I left at Uncle Billy's, and then me for the wide, wide world again. The Honorable Sam took off his spectacles to wipe them, but when Hale's back was turned, his handkerchief went to his eyes. Don't you worry, Jack. All right, Sam. An hour later, Hale was at the livery stable for a horse to ride to Lonesome Cove, for he had sold his big black to help out expenses for the trip to England. Old Dan Harris, the stableman, stood in the door and silently pointed to a gray horse in the barnyard. You know that horse? Yes. You know what he's here for? I've heard. Well, I'm looking for Dave every day now. Well, maybe I'd better ride Dave's horse now, said Hale jestingly. I wish you would, said old Dan. No, said Hale. If he's coming, I'll leave the horse so that he can get to me as quickly as possible. You might send me word, Uncle Dan, ahead, so that he can't waylay me. I'll do that very thing, said the old man seriously. I was joking, Uncle Dan, but I ain't. The matter was out of Hale's head before he got through the great gap. How the memories thronged of June. June, June. You didn't give her a chance. That was what Bud had said. Well, had he given her a chance? Why shouldn't he go to her and give her the chance now? He shook his shoulders at the thought and laughed with some bitterness. He hadn't the car fare for halfway across the continent, and even if he had, he was a promising candidate for matrimony, and again he shook his shoulders and settled his soul for his purpose. He would get his things together and leave those hills forever. How lonely had been his trip. How lonely was the God-forsaken little town behind him. How lonely the road and hills and the little white clouds in the zenith straight above him, and how unspeakably lonely the green dome of the great pine that shot into view from the north as he turned a clump of rhododendron with uplifted eyes. Not a breath of air moved. The green expanse about him swept upward like a wave, but unflecked, motionless, except for the big pine which, that far away, looked like a bit of green spray sprouting on its very crest. Old man, he muttered, you know, and as to a brother he climbed toward it. No wonder they called you lonesome. he said as he went upward into the bright stillness. And when he dropped into the dark stillness of a shadow and forest gloom on the other side, he said again, "My God, no wonder they called you lonesome." And still the memories of June thronged, at the brook, at the river, and when he saw the smokeless chimney of the old cabin, he all but groaned aloud. But he turned away from it, unable to look again, and went down the river toward Uncle Billy's mill. Old Hun threw her arms around him and kissed him. "John," said Uncle Billy, "I've got $300 in an old yarn sock under one of them hearthstones, and it's yourn. Old Hun says so too." Hale choked. "I want you to go to June. Dave'll worry her down and get her if you don't go, and if you don't worry her down, he'll come back here and try to kill you. I've always thought one of you would have to die for that gal, and I want it to be Dave. You two have got to fight it out some day, and you might as well meet him out there as here. You didn't give that little gal a fair chance, John, and I want you to go to June." "No, I can't take your money, Uncle Billy. God bless you and old Hun. I'm going, I don't know where, and I'm going now." End chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cole McKinnon. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 33. Clouds were gathering as Hale rode up the river after telling old Hun and Uncle Billy goodbye. He had meant not to go to the cabin in Lonesome Cove, but when he reached the forks of the road, he stopped his horse and sat in indecision with his hands folded on the pommel of his saddle and his eyes on the smokeless chimney. The memories tugging at his heart drew him irresistibly on, for it was the last time. At a slow walk he went noiselessly through the deep sand around the clump of rhododendron. The creek was clear as crystal once more, but no geese cackled and no dog barked. The door of the spring house gaped wide. The barn door sagged on its hinges. The yard fence swayed drunkenly, and the cabin was still as a gravestone. But the garden was alive, and he swung from his horse at the gate, and with his hands clasped behind his back walked slowly through it. June's garden. The garden he had planned and planted for June, that they had tended together and apart, and that, thanks to the old miller's care, was the one thing, save the sky above, left in spirit unchanged. The periwinkles, pink and white, were almost gone. The flags were at half-mast and sinking fast. The annunciation lilies were bending their white foreheads to the near kiss of death, but the pinks were fragrant. The poppies were poised on slender stalks like brilliant butterflies at rest. The hollyhocks shook soundless pink bells to the wind. Roses, as scarlet as June's lips, bloomed everywhere, and the richness of midsummer was at hand. Quietly Hale walked the paths, taking a last farewell of plant and flower, and only the sudden patter of raindrops made him lift his eyes to the angry sky. The storm was coming now in earnest, and he had hardly time to lead his horse to the barn and dash to the porch when the very heavens, with a crash of thunder, broke loose. Sheet after sheet swept down the mountains like wind-driven clouds of mist, thickening into water as they came. The shingles rattled as though with the heavy slapping of hands. The pines creaked, and the sudden dusk outside made the cabin, when he pushed the door open, as dark as night. Kindling a fire, he lit his pipe and waited. The room was damp and musty, but the presence of June almost smothered him. Once he turned his face. June's door was ajar, and the key was in the lock. He rose to go to it and look within, and then dropped heavily back into his chair. He was anxious to get away now, to get to work. Several times he rose restlessly and looked out the window. Once he went outside and crept along the wall of the cabin to the east and the west, but there was no break of light in the murky sky, and he went back to pipe and fire. By and by the wind died, and the rain steadied into a dogged downpour. He knew what that meant. There would be no letting up now in the storm, and for another night he was a prisoner. So he went to his saddle pockets and pulled out a cake of chocolate, a can of potted ham, and some crackers, munched his supper, went to bed, and lay there with sleepless eyes, while the lights and shadows from the wind-swayed fire flickered about him. After a while his body dozed, but his racked brain went seething on in endless march of fantastic dreams, in which June was the central figure always, until of a sudden young Dave leapt into the center stage in the dream tragedy forming in his brain. They were meeting face to face at last, and the place was the big pine. Dave's pistol flashed, and his own stuck in the holster as he tried to draw. There was a crash and rapport, and he sprang upright in bed, but it was a crash of thunder that wakened him, and that, in that swift instant perhaps, had caused his dream. The wind had come again, and was driving the rain like soft bullets against the wall of the cabin next which he lay. He got up, threw another stick of wood on the fire, and sat before the leaping blaze, curiously disturbed, but not by the dream. Somehow he was again in doubt. Was he going to stick it out in the mountains after all? And if he should, was not the reason deep down in his soul the foolish hope that June would come back again? No, he thought, searching himself fiercely, that was not the reason. He honestly did not know what his duty to her was, what even was his inmost wish, and almost with a groan he paced the floor to and fro. Meantime the storm raged. A tree crashed on the mountainside, and the lightning that smote it winked into the cabin so like a mocking, malignant eye that he stopped in his tracks, threw open the door, and stepped outside as though to face an enemy. The storm was majestic, and his soul went into the mighty conflict of earth and air, whose beginning and end were in eternity. The very mountain tops were rimmed with zigzag fire, which shot upwards, splitting a sky that was black as a netherworld, and under it the great trees swayed like willows under rolling clouds of gray rain. One fiery streak lit up for an instant the big pine, and it seemed to dart straight down upon its proud, tossing crest. For a moment the beat of the watcher's heart and the flight of his soul stopped still. A thunderous crash came slowly to his waiting ears. Another flash came, and Hale stumbled with a sob back into the cabin. God's finger was pointing the way now. The big pine was no more. End chapter 33.
Chapter 34 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 34. The big pine was gone. He had seen it first one morning at daybreak, when the valley on the other side was a sea of mist that threw soft, clinging spray to the very mountain tops. For even above the mist that morning its mighty head arose, sole visible proof that the earth still slept beneath. He had seen it at noon, but little less majestic among the oaks that stood about it. He had seen it catching the last light at sunset, clean-cut against the afterglow, and like a dark, silent, mysterious sentinel guarding the mountain pass under the moon. He had seen it giving place with somber dignity to the passing burst of spring, had seen it green among dying autumn leaves, green in the gray of winter trees, and still green in a shroud of snow, a changeless promise that the earth must wake to life again. It had been the beacon that had led him into Lonesome Cove, the beacon that led June to the outer world. From it her flying feet had carried her into his life. Past it, the same feet had carried her out again. It had been their trusting place, had kept their secrets like a faithful friend, and had stood to him as the changeless symbol of their love. It had stood, a mute but sympathetic witness of his hopes, his despairs, and the struggles that lay between them. In dark hours it had been a silent comforter, and in the last year it had almost come to symbolize his better self. As to that self he came slowly back, and in the darkest hour it was the last friend to whom he had meant to say good-bye. Now it was gone. Always he had lifted his eyes to it every morning when he rose, but now, next morning, He hung back consciously, as one might shrink from looking at the face of a dead friend, and when at last he raised his head to look upward to it, an impenetrable shroud of mist lay between them, and he was glad. And still he could not leave. The little creek was a lashing torrent, and his horse, heavily laden as he must be, could hardly swim with his weight across so swift a stream. But mountain streams were like June's temper, up quickly and quickly down. So it was noon before he plunged into the tide with his saddle pockets over one shoulder and his heavy transit under one arm. Even then his snorting horse had to swim a few yards, and he reached the other bank soaked to his waistline. But the warm sun came out just as he entered the woods, and as he climbed, the mist broke about him and scuttled upward like white sails before a driving wind. Once he looked back from a fire scald in the woods at the lonely cabin in the cove, but it gave him so keen a pain that he would not look again. The trail was slippery, and several times he had to stop to let his horse rest and to slow the beating of his own heart. But the sunlight leaped gladly from wet leaf to wet leaf until the trees looked decked out for unseen fairies, and the birds sang as though there was nothing on earth but joy for all its creatures, and the blue sky smiled above as though it had never bred a lightning flash or a storm. Hale dreaded the last spur before the little gap was visible, but he hurried up the steep, and when he lifted his apprehensive eyes, the gladness of the earth was as nothing to the sudden joy in his own heart. The big pine stood majestic, still unscathed, as full of divinity and hope to him as a rainbow in the eastern sky. Hale dropped his reins, lifted one hand to his dizzy head, let his transit to the ground, and started for it on a run. Across the path lay a great oak, with a white wound running the length of its mighty body, from crest to shattered trunk, and over it he leaped, and like a child caught his old friend in both arms. After all, he was not alone. One friend would be with him till death, on that border line between the world in which he was born and the world he had tried to make his own, and he could face now the old one again with a stouter heart. There it lay before him, with its smoke and fire and noise and simmering activities, just awakening to life again. He lifted his clenched fist toward it. "You got me once," he muttered, "but this time I'll get you." He turned quickly and decisively. There would be no more delay, and he went back and climbed over the big oak that, instead of his friend, had fallen victim to the lightning's kindly whim, and led his horse out into the underbrush. As he approached within 10 yards of the path, a metallic note rang faintly on the still air on the other side of the pine, and down the mountain. Something was coming up the path. So he swiftly knotted his bridle reins around a sapling, stepped noiselessly into the path, and noiselessly slipped past the big tree, where he dropped to his knees, crawled forward, and lay flat, peering over the cliff and down the winding trail. He had not long to wait. A riderless horse filled the opening in the covert of trees that swallowed up the path. It was gray, and he knew it as he knew the saddle as his old enemy's Dave. Dave had kept his promise. He had come back. Their dream was coming true, and they were to meet at last face to face. One of them was to strike a trail more lonesome than the trail of the Lonesome Pine, and that man would not be John Hale. One detail of the dream was going to be left out, he thought grimly, and very quietly he drew his pistol, cocked it, sighted it on the opening. It was an easy shot, and waited. He would give that enemy no more chance than he would a mad dog, or would he? The horse stopped to browse. He waited so long that he began to suspect a trap. He withdrew his head and looked about him, on either side and behind, listening intently for the crackling of a twig or a footfall. He was about to push backward to avoid possible attack from the rear when a shadow shot from the opening. His face paled and looked sick of a sudden. His clenched fingers relaxed about the handle of his pistol, and he drew it back, still cocked, turned on his knees, walked past the pine, and by the fallen oak stood upright, waiting. He heard a low whistle calling to the horses below, and a shudder ran through him. He heard the horse coming up the path. He clenched his pistol convulsively, and his eyes lit by an unearthly fire and fixed on the edge of the boulder around which they must come, burned an instant later on June. At the cry she gave, he flashed a haunted look, right and left, stepped swiftly to one side, and stared past her, still at the boulder. She had dropped the reins and started toward him, but at the pine she stopped short. "Where is he?" Her lips opened to answer, but no sound came. Hale pointed at the horse behind her. "That's his. He sent me word. He left that horse in the valley to ride over here when he came back to kill me. Are you with him?" For a moment she thought from his wild face that he had gone crazy, and she stared silently. Then she seemed to understand, and with a moan she covered her face with her hands and sank weeping in a heap at the foot of the pine. The forgotten pistol dropped, full cocked to the soft earth, and Hale, with bewildered eyes, went slowly to her. "Don't cry," he said gently, starting to call her name. "Don't cry," he repeated, and he waited helplessly. "He's dead. Dave was shot out west," she sobbed. "I told him I was coming back. He gave me his horse. Oh, how could you?" "Why did you come back?" he asked, and she shrank as though he had struck her, but her sobs stopped and she rose to her feet. "Wait," she said, and she turned from him to wipe her eyes with her handkerchief. Then she faced him. "When Dad died, I learned everything. You made him swear never to tell me, and he kept his word until he was on his deathbed. You did everything for me. It was your money. You gave me back the old cabin in the cove. It was always you, and there was never anybody else but you." She stopped, for Hale's face was as though graven from stone. "And you came back to tell me that?" "Yes." "You could have written that." "Yes," she faltered, "but I had to tell you face to face." "Is that all?" Again the tears were in her eyes. "No," she said tremulously. "Then I'll say the rest for you. You wanted to come to tell me of the shame you felt when you knew." She nodded violently. "But you could have written that, too, and I could have written that you mustn't feel that way then." He spoke slowly. "You mustn't rob me of the dearest happiness I ever knew in my whole life." "I knew you'd say that," she said like a submissive child. The sternness left his face, and he was smiling now. "And you wanted to say that the only return you could make was to come back and be my wife." "Yes," she faltered again. "I did feel that. I did." "You could have written that, too, but you thought you had to prove it by coming back yourself." This time she nodded no assent, and her eyes were streaming. He turned away, stretching out his arms to the woods. "God, not that. No, no." "Listen, Jack." As suddenly his arms dropped, she controlled her tears, but her lips were quivering. "No, Jack, not that. Thank God I came because I wanted to come," she said steadily. "I loved you when I went away. I loved you every minute since." Her arms were stealing about his neck, her face was upturned to his, and her eyes, moist with gladness, were looking into his wondering eyes. "And I love you now, Jack." June. The leaves about them caught his cry and quivered with the joy of it, and above their heads the old pine breathed its blessing with the name June, June, June. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 35. With a mystified smile, but with no question, Hale silently handed his penknife to June, and when smiling, but without a word, she walked behind the old pine, he followed her. There he saw her reach up and dig the point of the knife into the trunk, and when, as he wonderingly watched her, she gave a sudden cry, Hale sprang toward her. In the hole she was digging he saw the gleam of gold, and then her trembling fingers brought out before his astonished eyes the little fairy stone that he had given her long ago. She had left it there for him, she said. Through tears and through his own tears, Hale pointed to the stricken oak. "It saved the pine," he said. "And you," said June. "And you," repeated Hale solemnly, and while he looked long at her, her arms dropped slowly to her sides, and he said simply, "Come." Leading the horses, they walked noiselessly through the deep sand around the clump of rhododendron, and there sat the little cabin of Lonesome Cove. The holy hush of a cathedral seemed to shut it in from the world, so still it was below the great trees that stood like sentinels on eternal guard. Both stopped, and June laid her head on Hale's shoulder, and they simply looked in silence. "Dear old home," she said with a little sob, and Hale, still silent, drew her to him. "You were never coming back again? I was never coming back again." She clutched his arm fiercely, as though even now something might spirit him away, and she clung to him while he hitched the horses and they walked up the path. "Why, the garden is just as I left it. The very same flowers in the very same places." Hale smiled. "Why not? I had Uncle Billy do that." "Oh, you dear, you dear." Her little room was shuttered tight as it always had been when she was away, and, as usual, the front door was simply chained on the outside. The girl turned with a happy sigh and looked about at the nodding flowers and the woods and the gleaming pool of the river below, and up the shimmering mountain to the big pine, topping it with somber majesty. "Dear old pine," she murmured, and almost unconsciously she unchained the door as she had so often done before, stepped into the dark room, pulling Hale with one hand after her, and almost unconsciously reaching upward with the other to the right of the door. Then she cried aloud, My key is there." That was in case you should come back some day. "Oh, I might. And think if I had come too late. Think if I hadn't come now." Again her voice broke, and still holding Hale's arm, she moved to her own door. She had to use both hands there, but before she let go, she said almost hysterically, "It's so dark. You won't leave me, dear, if I let you go?" For answer, Hale locked his arms around her, and when the door opened, he went in ahead of her and pushed open the shutters. The low sun flooded the room, and when Hale turned, June was looking with wild eyes from one thing to another in the room: her rocking chair at a window, her sewing close by, a book on the table, her bed made up in the corner, her washstand of curly maple, the pitcher full of water and clean towels hanging from the rack. Hale had gotten out the things she had packed away, and the room was just as she had always kept it. She rushed to him, weeping. "It would have killed me," she sobbed. "It would have killed me." She strained him tightly to her wet face against his cheek. Think if I hadn't come now." Then, loosening herself, she went all about the room with a caressing touch to everything, as though it were alive. The book was the volume of Keats he had given her, which had been loaned to Loretta before June went away. "Oh, I wrote for it and wrote for it," she said. "I found it in the post office," said Hale, "and I understood." She went over to the bed. "Oh," she said with a happy laugh, "you've got one slip inside out." And she whipped the pillow from its place, changed it, and turned down the edge of the covers in a triangle. "That's the way I used to leave it," she said shyly. Hale smiled. "I never noticed that." She turned the bureau and pulled open a drawer, and there were white things with frills and blue ribbons, and she flushed. "Oh," she said, "these haven't even been touched." Again Hale smiled, but he said nothing. One glance had told him there were things in that drawer too sacred for his big hands. "I'm so happy, so happy." Suddenly she looked him over from head to foot, his rough riding boots, old riding breeches, and blue flannel shirt. "I am pretty rough," he said. She flushed, shook her head, and looked down at her smart cloth suit of black. "Oh, you are all right, but you must go out now, just for a little while. What are you up to, little girl?" "How I love to hear that again." "Aren't you afraid I'll run away?" he said at the door. "I'm not afraid of anything else in this world any more." "Well, I won't." He heard her moving around as he sat planning on the porch. Tomorrow, he thought, and then an idea struck him that made him dizzy. From within, June cried, Here I am." And out she ran in the last crimson gown of her young girlhood, her sleeves rolled up and her hair braided down her back as she used to wear it. "You've made up my bed, and I'm going to make yours, and I'm going to cook your supper. What's the matter?" Hale's face was radiant with the heaven-born idea that lighted it, and he seemed hardly to notice the change she had made. He came over and took her in his arms. "Oh, sweetheart, my sweetheart." A spasm of anxiety tightened her throat, but Hale laughed from sheer delight. "Never you mind, it's a secret," and he stood back to look at her. She blushed as his eyes went downward to her perfect ankles. "It is too short," she said. "No, no, not for me. You're mine now, little girl, mine. Do you understand that?" "Yes," she whispered, her mouth trembling. Again he laughed joyously. "Come on," he cried, and he went into the kitchen and brought out an axe. "I'll cut wood for you." She followed him out to the woodpile, and then she turned and went into the house. Presently the sound of his axe rang through the woods, and as he stopped to gather up the wood, he heard a creaking sound. June was drawing water at the well, and he rushed toward her. "You mustn't do that." She flashed a happy smile at him. "You just go back and get that wood. I reckon," she used the word purposely, "I've done this afore." Her strong, bare arms were pulling the leaking, moss-covered old bucket swiftly up, hand under hand. So he got the wood while she emptied the bucket into a pail, and together they went laughing into the kitchen. And while he built the fire, June got out the coffee grinder and the meal to mix, and settled herself with the grinder on her lap. "Oh, isn't it fun?" She stopped grinding suddenly. "What would the neighbors say?" "We haven't any." "But if we had?" "Terrible," said Hale with mock solemnity. "I wonder if Uncle Billy is at home." Hale trembled at his luck. "That's a good idea. I'll ride down for him while you're getting supper." "No, you won't," said June. "I can't spare you. Is that old horn here yet?" Hale brought it out from behind the cupboard. "I can get him if he is at home." Hale followed her out to the porch, where she put her red mouth to the old trumpet. One long, mellow hoot rang down the river and up the hills. Then there were three short ones, and a single long blast again. "That's the old signal," she said, "and he'll know I want him bad." Then she laughed. "He may think he's dreaming, so I'll blow for him again." And she did. "There now," she said, "he'll come." It was well she did blow again, for the old miller was not at home, and old Hon, down at the cabin, dropped her iron when she heard the horn and walked to the door, dazed and listening. Even when it came again, she could hardly believe her ears, and but for her rheumatism, she would have herself have started at once for Lonesome Cove. As it was, she ironed no more, but sat in the doorway almost beside herself with anxiety and bewilderment, looking down the road for the old miller to come home. Back the two went into the kitchen, and Hale sat at the door watching June as she fixed the table and made the coffee and corn bread. Once only he disappeared, and that was when suddenly a hen cackled, and with a shout of laughter he ran out to come back with a fresh egg. "Now, my Lord," said June, her hair falling over her eyes and her face flushed from the heat. "No," said Hale, "I'm going to wait on you." "For the last time," she pleaded, and to please her he did sit down, and every time she came to his side with something he bent to kiss the hand that served him. "You're nothing but a big nice boy," she said. Hale held out a lock of his hair near the temples, and with one finger silently followed the track of wrinkles in his face. "It's premature," she said, "and I love every one of them." And she stopped to kiss him on the hair. "And those are nothing but troubles. I'm going to smooth every one of them away." "If they're troubles, they'll go now," said Hale. All the time they talked of what they would do with Lonesome Cove. "Even if we were to go away, we'll come back once a year," said Hale. "Yes," nodded June, "once a year. I'll tear down those mining shacks, float them down the river, and sell them as lumber." "Yes." "And I'll stock the river with bass again." "Yes." "And I'll plant young poplars to cover the site of every bit of uptorn earth along the mountain there. I'll bury every bottle and tin can in the cove. I'll take away every sign of civilization, every sign of the outside world." "And leave old Mother Nature to cover up the scars," said June, "so that Lonesome Cove will be just as it was." "Just as it was in the beginning," echoed June, "and shall be to the end," said Hale, "and there will never be anybody here but you." "And you," said June. While she cleared the table and washed the dishes, Hale fed the horses and cut more wood, and it was dusk when he came to the porch. Through the door he saw that she had made his bed in one corner, and through her door he saw one of the white things that had lain untouched in her drawer, now stretched out on her bed. The stars were peeping through the blue spaces of a white clouded sky, and the moon would be coming by and by. In the garden the flowers were dim, quiet, and restful. Kingfishers screamed from the river, an owl hooted in the woods, and crickets chirped about them. But every passing sound seemed only to accentuate the stillness in which they were engulfed. Close together they sat on the old porch, and she made him tell of everything that had happened since she left the mountains. And she told him of her flight from the mountains and her life in the West, of her father's death and the homesickness of the ones who still were there. "Bub is cowboy and wouldn't come back for the world, but I could never have been happy there," she said, "even if it hadn't been for you here." "I'm just a plain civil engineer now," said Hale. "An engineer without even a job." His face darkened. "It's a shame, sweetheart, for you." She put one hand over his lips and with the other turned his face so that she could look into his eyes. In the mood of bitterness they did show worn, hollow, and sad, and round them the wrinkles were deep. "Silly," she said, tracing them gently with her fingertips. "I love every one of them, too." And she leaned over and kissed them. "We're going to be happy each and every day and all day long. We'll live at the Gap in winter, and I'll teach." "No, you won't." "Then I'll teach you to be patient and how little I care for anything else in the world while I've got you. And I'll teach you to care for nothing else while you've got me. And you'll have me, dear, forever and ever." "Amen," said Hale. Something rang out in the darkness far down the river, and both sprang to their feet. "It's Uncle Billy," cried June, and she lifted the old horn to her lips. With the first blare of it, a cheery halloo answered, and a moment later they could see a gray horse coming up the road, coming at a gallop, and they went down to the gate and waited. "Hello, Uncle Billy," cried June. The old man answered with a fox-hunting yell, and Hale stepped behind a bush. "Jumpin' Jehoshaphat, it is you, June. Are you all right?" "Yes, Uncle Billy." The old man climbed off his horse with a groan. "Lordy, Lordy, Lordy, but I was scared." He had his hands on June's shoulder and was looking at her with a bewildered face. "What are you doing here alone, baby?" June's eyes shone. "Nothing, Uncle Billy." Hale stepped into the sight. Oh, I see. You back and he ain't gone. Well, bless my soul if this ain't the beatin'est." He looked from one to the other, and his kind old face beamed with a joy that was but little less than their own. "You come back to stay?" June nodded. "My, where's that horn? I want it right now. Old Hon down there's a thinkin' she's gone crazy, and I thought she shortly was when she said she heard you blow that horn, and she told me the minute I got here, if hit was you, to blow 3 times. And straightway 3 blasts rang down the river. Now she's all right if she don't die of curiosity afore I get back and tell her why you come. Why did you come back, baby? Give me a drink of water, son. I reckon me and the old hoss ain't traveled such a gait in 5 years." June was whispering something to the old man when Hale came back, and what it was the old man's face told plainly. "Yes, Uncle Billy, right away," said Hale. "Just as soon as you can get your license." Hale nodded. "And June says I'm going to do it." "Yes," said Hale, "right away." Again June had to tell the story to Uncle Billy that she had told to Hale and to answer his questions, and it was an hour before the old miller rose to go. Hale called them into June's room and showed him a piece of paper. "Is it good now?" he asked. The old man put on his spectacles, looked at it, and chuckled. "Just as good as the day you got it." "Well, can't you right now? Does June know?" "Not yet. I'm going to tell her now." "June," he called. "Yes, dear?" Uncle Billy moved hurriedly to the door. "You just wait till I get out of here." He met June in the outer room. going, Uncle Billy?" "Go on, baby," he said, hurrying by her. "I'll be back in a minute." She stopped in the doorway, her eyes wide again with sudden anxiety, but Hale was smiling. "You remember what you said at the Pine, dear?" The girl nodded, and she was smiling now when, with sweet seriousness, she said again, "Your least wish is now law to me, my lord." "Well, I'm going to test it now. I've laid a trap for you." She shook her head. "And you've walked right into it." "I'm glad." She noticed now the crumpled piece of paper in his hand, and she thought it was some sort of business. "Oh," she said reproachfully, "you aren't going to bother with anything of that kind now?" "Yes," he said. "I want you to look over this." "Very well," she said resigningly. He was holding the paper out to her, and she took it and held it to the light of the candle. Her face flamed, and she turned remorseful eyes upon him. "And you've kept that, too? You've had it when you were wiser, maybe, than you are now. God save me from ever being such a fool again." Tears started in her eyes. "You haven't forgiven me," she cried. "Uncle Billy says it's as good now as it was then." He was looking at her queerly now, and his smile was gone. Slowly his meaning came to her like a flush that spread over her face and throat. She drew one long quavering breath, and with parted lips and her great shining eyes wide, she looked at him. "Now?" she whispered. "Now," he said. Her eyes dropped to the coarse gown. She lifted both hands for a moment to her hair, and unconsciously she began to roll one crimson sleeve down her round white arm. "No," said Hale, "just as you are." She went to him then, put her arms about his neck, and with head thrown back she looked at him long with steady eyes. "Yes," she breathed out, "just as you are and now." Uncle Billy was waiting for them on the porch, and when they came out, he rose to his feet, and they faced him hand in hand. The moon had risen. The big pines stood guard on high against the outer world. Nature was their church, and the stars were the candles. And, as if to give them even a better light, the moon had sent a luminous sheen down the dark mountainside to the very garden in which the flowers whispered like waiting happy friends. Uncle Billy lifted his hand, and a hush of expectancy seemed to come even from the farthest star. End of chapter 35. End of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr.